So you're recording now?
I am recording now, yes.
Okay, great.
So don't mention your social security number, your mother's maiden name, anything like that.
Yeah, no, you're right. Basically, I was kind of drawn to. I can't remember where I started listening to your show. I can't remember because it was your show on the network that I listened to first.
Well, the first thing the first time I remember you coming into contact with me was when you were talking about Shadowhawk. So it might have been that you got brought in with the Shadowhawk show, because we've still talked about it one of these days, doing something with Shadowhawk, and I'm open to that. But I don't want to. You've also got a young child at home, and it's later for you, so I'm not going into that. But that's my recollection of first making contact. Yeah, you might have done some likes or retweets or something before that, but in terms of actually discussing stuff with us, I think it was Shadowhawk.
Yeah, no, I think I think I've got like an admiration for the fact that you stuck with Shadowhawk for so long. So my background was getting into comics in the early 90s. Jim Lee's X-Men #1 was the one that pushed me over the line and it coincided with me having a job where I had money and no bills to pay because I was 17, living with my parents. So all of my money went on comics. I discovered a comic shop, which meant that after buying my first comic in a newsagent, all of a sudden I had 3 months worth that were ahead of the newsagents. So it meant I bought X-Men 1 week, went to a comic shop the next week, bought 2 and 3, and then discovered X-Force 1, 2 and 3, and then Spider-Man 1, 2 and 3, and X-Factor, and just went off on one, and so I bought all of that Image stuff. I had a standing order, which was extreme, all Image basically, and I remember distinctly one day having spent about 70 quid on new comics and sitting there in the sun on a day off with a pile of comics and looking at like Brigade and Bloodstrike and these things and thinking, God, something's got to give. Like this is awful. I can't keep doing this. And then that's when I sort of moved over to, I don't know, Dark Horse and things. Ended up working in a really good comic shop in London in Gosh, and then spent about 10 years working there, which is probably where my working comic shops most sort of parallels your own. So it's really interesting listening to somebody bang on about Spawn 26 when no one else cares, but I'm quite fascinated by the Greg Capullo, McFarlane, who drew it, who inked it type stuff. So yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, I made a point of checking out as many of the shops in town. Were you in Edinburgh at that time, or you said London? Didn't you?
Well, so I was born in London, lived in Barcelona for 8 years, and I've been in Edinburgh since 2012. So I would have been here when you came to visit. But yeah, I'm originally from London, worked in Gosh there, but I've been out of comic shops for 20 years now, I think.
Do you frequent any of the shops in that area?
Yeah, I mean Edinburgh's got not much going for it. There's Forbidden Planet, which is good. I like the staff, but it's basically new comics and merchandise, like nothing in the way of back issues at all. And then there's another comic shop which is basically run by a madman. I mean, he's like a full-on madman. He threw me out of his shop and told me I was the worst customer he ever had for wanting to look inside a comic. That was mad. And it's funny you mentioned martial law because he doesn't have anything. I mean, you went there. He doesn't have anything priced. He doesn't have anything in order to speak of. And I went in before I had all my martial, like all the issues. He had a martial law issue. I pulled it out, no price on it. How much is that? And he went, £7. And I was like, yeah, I'm not going back there. Like I'm not getting into.
Oh yeah, no. I have gotten commissions in recent years. I've started to kind of pull back on that some. But one of my red flags when it comes to commissions is when I'm talking to somebody and I'm like, what's your rates? Do you have a rate list, anything like that? They're like, oh, what do you think it's worth? It's like, oh, fuck off. Okay, I know you're going to be more trouble than you're worth. Never fucking mind. Without fail, the guys who pull that shit on me are mostly they're whack jobs or they're con men, and I end up getting burned one way or the other. So it just pisses me off. And then with comic shops, again, as a retailer, you know what it's like on both sides of the counter. And so being dicked around like that, as a fan, you don't want to do that. So if you do that as a retailer, it's like you're even worse than if you're just some schlub that is just there as a job, which isn't really seemingly a thing anymore. I don't think anybody works in a comic shop if they're not a fan, because there's so many more lucrative things you could do. But back in the day, you'd have these guys who would just do it because there was money in it, and they literally wouldn't know, and you'd still be like, well, I don't want to be dealing with this guy because he's more trouble than he's worth. But for a fan, somebody who's obviously a collector, to do that to you is like, you son of a, it's a huge turnoff.
Yeah. Have you've seen the film High Fidelity, right?
Well, I've told that story on a podcast before, haven't I? Have I not?
No.
Well, maybe, I'm being presumptuous. There's no guarantee. Even if I told on a podcast, you wouldn't necessarily.
I've listened to a lot. I've not listened to everything.
No. It's okay. It's okay. I hate, because I don't listen to every podcast, every person I'm friendly with. It's just like I try to be presumptuous. My main thing was I didn't want to repeat myself. You'd already heard the story. It's like, I heard that on the show. No. Don't repeat yourself. But what had happened was I'd seen one of Mac's favorite movies is High Fidelity. Grosse Point Blank, and we were actually still doing role. Yeah, and we were doing role playing at that time, and I was actually supposed to kind of customize a campaign to be more like that character from that movie, and I blew it because I was a terrible DM. Anyway, so we both got really into Grosse Point Blank, and then the woman that I ran the shop with, she got a bunch of screener copies of VHSs, and she kicked them my way to watch some, and High Fidelity was in there. So I watched it with the assumption that I was going to be watching Grosse Point Blank 2, which makes no fucking sense. There's no reason why my brain would even go there, but for some reason, I don't know if I was expecting that, or maybe I was expecting One Crazy Summer 2, or say anything but what was actually on the screen. And so I watched it, and I thought it was kind of depressing, and I wasn't super into it, and gave the screeners back to her, and would kind of moved on. And it came up in conversation not too long afterwards, and one of my friends, it might have been Mac, or it might have been Fix It, I don't know which of the two, they pointed out, I don't know why you don't like that movie, it's about you. And naming the ways in which I was like Rob, how the dynamics of the shop were like the dynamics in the movie. And so the narcissism drove me back to the movie, watched it again. It's like, oh yeah, okay, now I get the appeal. So just put that out there.
And then you're like, which one am I? In the book version of that, the Nick Hornby novel, it's a record shop on Holloway Road in North London, and I was working in my first job in a comic shop was in a comic shop 3 doors along from a record shop on Holloway Road, and I was going through like a big breakup with my first on and off girlfriend, love of my life at the time, and so that film struck a serious chord with me, and it's kind of followed me, like for me, that dynamic in that shop, although it's a record shop, could be a comic shop, it could be, I don't know how many other hobbies are similar, but it could easily just be remade as a comic shop today.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something about fandom, and you can be a fan of so many different things in this world. Like the three of us went to this antique mall a few weeks back, or we were in a guy's day out, and there's all these little. It's just there's a stream of different weird shops. Here's the stamp collector shop. Here's the coin collector shop. Here's the general antiques place. Here's the guy who collects fire trucks, like Tonka trucks and stuff. And it was sort of like a display of obsessions. And I bet every single one of those shops has its own little collective of people who are just way too into the stuff, know way too much about it, know far too few people who can in any way communicate and relate to any of this stuff. And I think that's the same probably any kind of fandom that exists. Yeah. So I mean, I think it's closer. I think records and comics are probably closer than a lot of this other stuff. But another one is Ghost World, where you've got all the jazz collectors and stuff. It's just you have these little communities of people that are into these niche things, and it's almost like a weird sort of like forced cohabitation. It's like, these are the people who know about the stuff that I'm into, so I have to have a relationship with them because there's nobody else on the planet that I can relate to about this stuff. So you have that weird sort of love-hate dynamics with the things that you love and the people that share that love with you. So I think that there's a universality to the specificity of that.
Yeah, but I don't know, but the interesting thing for me with comics retail is just how many people have the love of it sort of beaten out of them, Like we used to have regulars who would come in and they would just buy Comic Book Marketplace and previews. And I think they only bought previews to find out what was coming up at Comic Book Marketplace. It was so depressing. Like I was in my sort of mid to late 20s and really in love with comics, and you know, 90s comics, there was a lot of shit, but it was also because of working in a shop, you got to be on the front line of actually finding the gems, you know, the little Frank Miller 8 pages in the back of something, or you know, Aaron Wiesenfeld appears and evolves in front of your eyes or whatever. And so I have a real fondness for 90s comics, not all of them. And
that was cool too, is being in a comic shop, especially being the person who orders and handles the books and puts them into the pull box and everything else. You'll learn which customers have tastes that are similar to yours, or you'll have a sense of what their tastes are so you can guide them in the right directions. But it's great when somebody comes up with something you would have never thought about, would have never seen, would have never crossed if you were the customer of the shop, you would never know this thing existed. But because you're the one who orders it and it all passes through your hands, you get to find these cool things that nobody ever heard of. Sometimes they never do hear of. I've got these things that are like mono obscurities where I love them and I'm the only one who knows the damn thing exists. But it definitely refines your taste, which is probably one of the reasons why it gets harder to deal with the mainstream regurgitation of the same ideas endlessly. But you're right. There are people, just by virtue of handling their books, will help to guide your taste because they give you opportunities you wouldn't have had otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of the sort of thing sort of spreads like a virus, you know. You'll be into something, you'll be ordering 5 copies of something, not having looked at it, and then someone you like will buy it, and you'll think, "Fuck, this is great," and then within a couple of months you're ordering 25 because you've told another 20 people about how good it is. I really miss, like, I don't miss retail salary, but I really miss that kind of enthusiasm for the work and things. And then like so now I'm sort of conscious of trying not to become that Comic Book Marketplace previews guy who's constantly banging on about how great it was in my day and how there's nothing to read. You know, there's a lot of people whose work I really like James Stokoe, who obviously did an Aliens mini as well as Godzilla and other stuff. James Harron, like, there's a lot of people whose work I'm really excited to see turn up in previews and then the shop. So yeah, I'm trying not to become like a nostalgia trick. And that's, again, the social media is great for that, for turning you onto stuff that you hadn't seen coming. And now, if anything, the biggest problem is that there's just too much. I haven't got the money, I haven't got the space to read as much great stuff as there is. But yeah, anyway, that's me.
Yeah, and for me with retailing, what it was letting people use me as their wall. Like they want to tell somebody something about their fandom, even if it's something that you have no interest in. And so you just sort of sit there nodding. It's like, yes, tell me more about this thing that I have no interest in. Oh, you're going to tell me about the same thing for the third or fourth time. Okay, cool. That's what I'm here for. That's part of what you're paying me for, is I'm the bartender. And that was the aspect that killed me. Like actually, it was fun. You know, it's Christmas every week when you're opening up the boxes and you're sorting out the books and stuff. Now, when you got people that are there first thing in the morning, like trying to get into the shop before it's even open, you're still getting shit out of the boxes and they want to try to be there for that. That's a little irritating. In your face,
trying to get to stuff first.
Wanting to get their stuff pulled immediately. It's like, I haven't even got the stuff out of the box yet, dude. But that was the fun stuff. I didn't mind that. Again, like you said, it was the conditions, the money, and you want to keep the things running. You're going to have to put up with folks that you wouldn't want to put up with, or wouldn't have to put up with otherwise. But I've never lost my love of the medium. I love how stories are told in comic books. This is my favorite way to receive a story. You've got the intimacy of prose, but you've got the scale and the visual stimulation from film and television. I just love the medium, and there's always somebody doing something that I'm interested in. So while I'm using a lot of my middle-aged disposable income to buy deluxe hardcovers of shit that I read when I was a child, I definitely do plenty of that. But I always try to make sure I'm looking at new stuff too. And it's fun to, like, my thing is there'll be creators that will get a fandom sometimes with the corporate comics. And again, the illusion of change, where nothing is ever resolved, nothing is ever final. Like for me, I read Jim Starlin's stuff and it's like, I don't care that Warlock and Thanos came back. Those stories for me were told back in the 70s. I didn't need them to come back and do new stories with them. The fact that nobody ever dies, nobody ever stays dead, nothing is ever permanent. There's always going to be another new Robin that everybody's mad about because they had their own favorite Robin, and now there's this new person who's in the role. I'm at a point, I'm too old for corporate comics. So if I go and I buy an independent book, which is one of the reasons why I've gravitated more towards that, I can read something like like Rick Remender's Low, where it's telling a complete story and that story ends and it's satisfying. And I've got those books on my shelf, and I'm glad that I have them because I got to see an authorial work where the person who had the story told the story, ended the story, and then we go on to the next story. I look at Jeff Lemire with his Black Hammer, where he was basically doing all the stuff with the 90s type of material, all the stuff that James Robinson was doing, redoing that in a new universe, being able to tell it to completion the way that he wanted it to be told. Love that. There's tons of stuff that out there that, I'm mourning the loss of the Paper Girls TV show because I really enjoyed how different that was from the comics. And
is that gone for sure?
Well, it was canceled by Amazon Prime, and they're Legendary's talking about shopping it around. But if it didn't make it on Prime, what are the odds it's going to make it someplace else? Everybody was trying to act like it was going to be Stranger Things season 5, and it's like, this is not that animal. They don't have that budget. If anything, it was telling small scale stories compared to the comics. And I really thoroughly enjoyed both. I thought they complement each other. It was one of those instances where usually somebody does something that you enjoy, and then somebody comes along and screws it up in adaptation. But with this, it felt almost like all the deleted scenes from the comics that we didn't get, and a development of the characters that we didn't have, because the comic is actually more like a Hollywood production. The comic book is a big budget couple of Hollywood movies. It's not a TV show. So the TV show gave us richer characters than the comics ever did, but I love the comics too. So I definitely never lost my love of the medium. I've always, it's such a passion for me, lifelong passion. I don't think I can ever lose that love. But you're right, the grind of watching, the latest event that's going to change everything until it changes back again, done by somebody, drawing on the same characters, since hardly any new characters have been created since the 90s, since creators are so terrified that they're going to give away a Deadpool and they'll never be able to create anything like that again, and it'll be and then the publishers, because they don't have new characters, they're starved for new characters, so they just keep coming up with permutations of the same characters. I have no time for. Give me Adam Warren on Empower. Give me Birthright. Give me one of these other great books that I'm enjoying that will come to a conclusion at some point. But in the meantime, we'll tell more personal stories that creators are clearly invested in until the story's completely told. That's what I always had the most passion for. It was never reading the latest monthly Spider-Man story. It was always what year-long epic is this creator going to tell, and then come to a rousing conclusion, and then we see what the next thing's going to be. That was always what I enjoyed. I was always built for trade waiting. I was always built for the long form storytelling. So I just went to where that was at, where it actually matters, where the gigantic monthly crossover between every title, it's so meaningless and so expensive. I can't get it up for anymore.
Yeah, I primarily follow artists. There are some writers who I follow. Right, for me, it's like art. The art is king. If it's a great story, all the better. I'll find that a mediocre story will be elevated by great art. So, for example, like Chuck Dixon for me is a writer who is kind of boilerplate. He's like 60 out of 100 maybe in general. But then as soon as he's with a great artist, he'll be elevated to like a 90. Like it'll be some of my favorite comics because he's working with someone who can really deliver like his kind of straight head action stories or whatever. So when it comes to big stories, like I get chucked out as soon as there's an art change or something like that. It really throws me off. It has to be something quite meaningful for me to stick with it despite an art change. So modern comics does work for me, but I sort of keep an eye on things. I'm sort of trade waiting, hoping that they don't sort of fuck things up and bring in some shit artist for the third arc, because then I'm never going to read it. So it's kind of it's a bit of a limitation in a way, but to be honest, I probably need a limitation because my house is full of books. So some kind of limitation probably helps.
Yeah, for me, I have my dollars. It's like, okay, this is how many dollars I'm willing to spend on a monthly basis. Beyond that, I've got to justify it. It's like, no, rein it in, buddy.
Yeah, no,
put something in a 401k, please.
It's interesting since we talked about talking. There's been a few shows where artist names have come up where like we're completely opposed, and I found it quite funny. Like Rick Leonardi and Klaus Janson have come up as like, oh no, that's not the guy for this job, and never been a fan of their work or whatever. whatever. And I'm like, fucking hell, I love those guys.
But everything's circumstantial too.
Strokes.
It's like when Terry Austin was inking Leonardo on, I think it was Cloak and Dagger. I thought that was a really great looking book. Klaus Janson was one of the best inkers in comics for years. I love a lot of the 70s work he did, especially when you do something over a guy like Gil Kane, who's somebody I really don't want to be messed with in the inking. And Klaus Janson messed with him
Avengers.
hard. Yeah, but in that instance, it worked so well that I thought that the sum was greater than the parts. I mean, I still prefer Gil on his own, but seeing him with Janson in the 70s was like seeing him all over again, like a whole new artist came from that merging. So it's every artist, I think, has a place where they can belong. They're just some guys that I'm just more, warm to than others. Some guys some art styles I'm more. We just recently were doing a podcast on Barry Windsor Smith, and it's like, for the most part, even though he has his quirks, and I get tired of everybody looking sleepy all the time, I'm pretty much always up for Barry Windsor Smith doing something. I just love looking at his work, period. Where there are other guys where I need them to be on the right project, like John Buscema on Conan bores me because I saw it for so long, but you put John Buscema with Tom Palmer on the Avengers, and that's some of the best Avengers stuff that there ever was. So it just depends on, and man, I miss inkers too. Like I was just looking at the previews, and I was looking at like Mark Silvestri's got that Batman book he's doing.
That awful looking Batman book.
It's so rough, and it's like, it looks fine, but I just keep thinking about how much better it would look with some nice inking on that. Clean up all those excess lines and stuff, leaving every line on there and just pumping up the contrast by scanning the pencils. It's not the same as a gloriously inked page, and it's obviously a lost form now, but man, I miss seeing that the synergy of two artists combining to make something better than the two as individuals.
Yeah, I mean, Mark Silvestri, I think, so just a couple of things. So John Buscema, I'm probably the same as you. I'll probably get like run out of town tied to my horse by a lot of the people that I interact with on Twitter or whatever. But John Buscema inking himself, it doesn't completely bore me. There's moments of it where I really like it. But yeah, that Conan stuff, if I pick up random Conan issues, there's very little to elevate one from the next. And yet, so there was an art of John Buscema book. It was an exhibition in Mallorca, and then they did an exhibition catalogue with all the art. I mean, fucking immense, beautiful exhibition. And the art book was all the pieces in the exhibition. IDW republished it. Looked amazing. And then the author was like, so John Buscema's great, of course, and he did these work on these Savage Conan magazines, and they brought in these inkers like Alcala, and it's just terrible. And I had to get rid of the book, but I couldn't keep it in my collection with such stupidity in the text, despite the fact that it's full of pretty pictures. But yeah, the Mark Silvestri thing, like for me, the last comic that I saw from him that looked halfway decent was, in fact, not even halfway decent. I really like it. Darkness #1 with Garth Ennis. He and Bat, who's a guy called Matt Banning, I think in real life, did issue 1, and then he and Bat did most of issue 2, and then it was like 25 inkers, Joe Weems, all these other people coming in, and he never drew another comic that I thought was worth looking at since. And the latest book irritates me because I think Matt Banning is still inking at DC. I think he inked Jim Starlin on one of those Cosmic Odyssey sort of Adam Strange type things. So I don't know why you wouldn't just get a decent inkering, but editors don't know what the fuck they're doing anymore anyway. So anyway, sorry, I sound like a mad old man now.
No, well, it's frustrating. Like I've been trying to get the WildStar episode of Spawnometer together again. It's been off and on for pretty much the entire year, and thankfully I finally got several issues worth of Spawn recorded with Fix-It, so I can actually, I couldn't do anything when I didn't have the Spawn segments recorded. But one of the things they talk about is like Jerry Ordway doesn't get a lot of work anymore, or get offered a lot of work anymore, and then like Terry Austin can't find a job, period. Like there's a study for him. Not too long back, Scott Williams was in town for a convention, and it occurred to me that since Jim Lee's mostly been kind of inking his own stuff, or really probably not, probably just shooting with pencils, I never liked Jim Lee as much as when he was being inked by other people, particularly Richard Bennett or Scott Williams. So now that Scott Williams isn't working, I'm pissed because these guys don't have just the money coming in because they deserve it, but also I'm pissed because the artists that they're associated with are not as good without them.
But Jim Lee's published work is still with Scott Williams. He's just not drawing anything at the moment.
Like most of the covers and
Squad
stuff
was. Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Well, and you're mentioning too, it's like you were talking about the Jim Starlin, Adam Warlock type stuff, and most of that was tied into like Infinite Crisis. So that's us with our protracted timelines, where you're talking about 10 to 15 years ago, you're talking about like Jim Lee on Suicide Squad. That's been about 5 to 7 years now. So it's like that was true not so long ago. But like if you look at most of the covers he's been doing for the last several years, all the spot images he does for DC, because he's already doing any interiors anyway. But it's mostly just him shot from the pencils. So in recent years, because that was one of the longest lived collaborations, I have to give Jim Lee credit. He continued to have an inker into the 2010s, but I don't think he's got him into the 2020s, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the Jim Lee stuff I've done. I mean, it's still Scott Williams on like, and I don't mean to sort of dig in on it, but it's still Scott Williams on like some of the big cover, because still Scott Williams is still basically tweeting Jim Lee images. He's still tweeting Jim Lee images of sort of Batman anniversary covers and Supergirl stuff and Superman stuff. So I think there's still something there. But yeah, I mean, Scott Williams has gone off on his own sort of road doing variants for Marvel and stuff, and kind of fair play to him. If you can't get Jim Lee and you can't get Wiesenfeld, Scott Williams fits. He's a happy medium, I guess.
Yeah, I think I've seen a few of those variants he's done, and I liked Williams in the rare instances where he'd actually do the full artwork. So I'd be interested in seeing more of that from him. I haven't, not much of it's crossed my desk so far.
Yeah, it's fine, you know. Just I don't know. My first experience with Scott Williams the penciler was in like a Wildstorm or Homage swimsuit, and it was a female character, but it was a spot on Jim Lee impersonation. Apart from the anatomy, it was all fucked up. So it's like slightly long neck, slightly funny arms. Everything was slightly off, but it looked like Jim Lee in every other aspect. And that was my first Scott Williams. And now everything I see from him is kind of the same. It's like looking at Jim Lee if you haven't cleaned your glasses properly.
Well, he always, like, I think the first time I saw him do an illustration on his own, he'd done either a t-shirt or a portfolio piece of the Punisher around the same time he was inking Portasio on that. And I remember looking at it in what it was one of the it was a solicitation like American Entertainment or one of those type of organizations. And I remember looking at it real close and was like, that kind of looks like Will's Portasio, but not quite. And I finally saw the signature and realized that one of the names wasn't there that I was used to seeing. And I definitely agree that Williams does look like the sum of the two artists. Well, I don't know how well known he is for inking Portasio now, but certainly he grew up with him, and a lot of his formative years were spent with Portasio, and that influence has never left him. So he definitely looks like a marriage of those two artists. And I do like it when I see it, but I don't see it very often in a sequential form. It's just, like you said, the occasional pin-up cover, thing like that.
Yeah, Strikeforce Morituri, I think, was the only thing he ever drew, or one of those new universe titles. I've never read. I don't think I've ever read an issue of them. I love that
you did that. You did the same thing that I've done for my entire life too. It's not a new universe title, but because it came around the same time with the same trade dress, in my brain it will always be a new universe title.
Oh, really?
So I'm glad I'm not the only one who does that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Wow, I thought Strikeforce Morituri, DP7. Was DP7 actually New Universe?
Yeah, because they canceled so many books at Marvel to make way for the New Universe, and all the books that came out around that time period was part of the 20th anniversary. They all kind of had that look to them, like it was a design aesthetic or something. So the association is just unconscious, but it's always been there.
Funny, but yeah, Scott Williams. If you, I don't know if you ever listened to the Felix Comic Art podcast.
No, that one. Felix, you say?
Yeah, he's a guy called Felix Liu. He's an art dealer.
No, I never heard. He's a podcast.
So he's an art dealer, and he's got a podcast, sometimes video cast, but he's an art rep for Daniel Warren Johnson, James Harron, Paul Pope, all sorts of good people. And his show is a mixture of collectors, comic art collectors, and sometimes creators who are also collectors, or just creators that he reps or whatever. But Scott Williams is a big collector, and there's an episode which is an interview with Scott Williams, and I think you'd really enjoy that because it does go into some of the weeds of the early kind of Homage Studios, Jim Lee, Wiesenfeld, like how that all came together, how it was like Wilson Scott and then Jim Lee joined later, and then you think Uncanny X-Men 266 or 267, like what the weird one that's a bit Wilson, a bit Jim Lee.
It's funny you mentioned it, because I do think I want to say it was one of the Spawnometers, but I definitely took material from a podcast like that, so that's probably the one that I heard, but probably that'd be the only one, because I got it in vlog form. I got it off of YouTube. I don't think I got it in YouTube in podcast form. I turned it into a podcast, but I think that's where I was listening to him because Williams only been heard in a few places, and that had to be one of the places I took that from then.
Yeah, because he did that, and then I think he did a Comic Art Fans more recently.
That's one of the things I loved about trades, which they've mostly stopped doing, is they don't really have introductions anymore for the most part, except for rare occasions. At least not from the corporate stuff. You do get that typically more often from the indie side of it because the creator wants to talk to the audience, and I appreciate that. But a lot of times the corporate guys will not give them the space. They won't allot the page count to them to do that. But what's great with Marvel's, and I've been doing this with the Epic collections, I was really resentful when they stopped putting out the Essentials, the black and white telephone book collections, and they moved to the more expensive color ones. But then I actually picked a few up, and I realized that they're doing stuff like putting Marvel Age articles in them and pinups and pages from Marvel Handbook and all these little extras. And then it's like, oh, okay, this is my DVD. This is what I want. I want those extras, and the omnibuses are really good about that. So it made it worthwhile for me just on that alone.
Yeah, I was never into Masterworks at all, and I picked up the Marshall, and we've gone way off topic at this point. But I picked up the Marshall Rogers Doctor Stranges on the recommendation of a Twitter friend, and in fact he just posted some images, and I was like, God, that looked good. What's that? And it was Marshall Rogers Inc. by Terry Austin. So I picked up those issues and loved them. And much as though I love having the original newsprint versions of these things, there was something about the technical aspects of those comics. So lots of color, what do you call it? Where they kind of color holds would be the modern term, but where they did surprints, where they did black line, but they made it purple. So Marshall Rogers plays an awful lot with like putting crazy stuff going on, but in colors rather than in black line. And I just thought it merited seeing in like the best printing possible. So I picked up those Doctor Strange Marvel Masterworks, and they're wicked. They're like full of like Roger Stern giving detailed background as to why Frank Miller didn't end up drawing it. Some Frank Miller designs for the characters that Gene Colan did on a fill-in issue before Marshall Rogers started. Like really, really nice. Exactly like you're describing. So you got all the issues, and then you got about maybe 40 pages of the back of stuff shot from original art and Roger Stern stuff and Marvel Age type interviews and everything. Really good.
Yeah, you know it's fans putting this stuff together because they know how to get us. You know, you're going to finally put the Marvel value stamp on glossy paper. All right, you sons of bitches, you got me, you know.
Well, that's what it's exactly what you say. Shows that it's not fans putting together the main stuff, you know. So like I've got a lot of trade paperbacks that have introductions that ultimately would turn out to be like, oh, I see why he did the intro, because he wrote that series that guy drew before, so it was him calling in a favor or whatever. But nonetheless, it's like Golden Age by James Robinson has got like a 5-page Howard Chaykin introduction talking about growing up reading Golden Age comics in early fandom in the 60s or whatever, and it's just fascinating. And at this point, the trade paperbacks are just like I don't know, it's just like incredibly
utilitarian,
commoditary. Yeah, they're utilitarian. They're commodities. They're just there. You're lucky. Like if the series had variants, they might stick all 4 variants on one page at the back or something shit like that. I really miss. I miss looking forward to a trade now. I kind of wince through them, and every once in a while they surprise me by actually being quite nice.
Yeah, you probably are one of the only people that would appreciate this. But one thing I've loathed about recent DC collections, and has literally been deal breakers for me, is the logos. The fact that they won't have the logos, the classic logos on there. They'll go and they'll put some shitty font for the letters JLA instead of that glorious JLA logo. And it's like, well, I'm not going to buy your $100 omnibus then because you didn't put the logo. And there's so much material that's out there right now that's done so anonymously. Where again, it's like it's just easier to put a font. So we're just going to put a font. And it's like, yeah, but I want to. I've got a bookshelf. I'm looking at my spines. I want to see that logo. I want to see that type of material, and that's just not going to do it for me. That's just not going to cut it. But it's weird. Thankfully, Marvel did it a little bit, but they seem to have gotten away from it. They're back to using recognizable trade dresses. More often than not all the time, but more often than DC does. But DC seem to go out of their way to just, especially images where the logos are integrated into the artwork, and so you end up with this big gappy space where you've just got a font now. Drives me freaking nuts. So little presentation things do make a difference. And when you're asking people to spend gobs of money on this stuff. It's like, okay, well, I'm going to nitpick if you're going to do that. But again, when you give me all those little extras, it's like, okay, you've got me. I'm hooked now. Just don't mess with my logos, please.
Yeah, I feel like Marvel. I feel like Marvel's attitude to new people coming to comics is like, yeah, we've done some films that you've really liked. We've done a load of comics that you really like. Come and read them if you want to read them, and we will present them to you in a way that people that want to see them in comics will also enjoy. Whereas DC's like, how can we frame this in a way that will attract readers from outside comics who would never read a Batman comic normally? Newsflash, they're still not going to read a Batman comic. They're not interested. All you're doing is turning off the people that would buy it otherwise, you know? So it's like Marvel recognize that they've got a product that is appealing to people already, whereas DC are constantly trying to reinvent, like every fucking 5 minutes they're reinventing themselves. You got Gary Frank power Shazam, then you got some Italian painter doing him with gritted teeth, then you got Jim Lee, and it's just like, decide what you want the character to be and then see if people want to read it, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. It's as a person who just can't quit DC, even though I don't buy the new stuff anymore, it's just so frustrating to see them. But again, that's a defining character of DC Comics since probably the 60s, is always feeling the middle child syndrome, just always feeling like, how am I going to win people over? You know, I don't have any confidence in my own stuff. I want to be as much like my older brother as possible, or the cool younger brother, or whatever it is that they're doing. They're constantly unwilling to be what they are and just, be the best DC. So yeah, completely feel that.
Yeah, maybe that's kind of much as though I'm loath to say it, like is a legacy of Stan Lee. Mm-hmm. You know, Stan Lee going out to university campuses and talking up Marvel Comics, that, you know, he had obviously some investment in, versus DC constantly trying to apologize for I don't know, stuff that the Comics Authority Code didn't like in the 1950s.
or just constantly say, like, what they've done, like you said, first they were architects of the Comics Code Authority, so they
yes.
basically created this anti-creative authoritarian group for the comics. They were the fascists of the comic book industry, and then afterwards it's them constantly apologizing for producing a bunch of stories for young children. It's like, I'm so sorry that we actually made like little kiddie stuff and that we didn't target college kids like Marvel did. We'll do everything we can to catch up. We'll murder, we'll rape, we'll do whatever you want us to do to show that we can be grown-ups too, just like Marvel, and just overcompensating constantly.
Yeah, I mean, my current comics experience is pretty similar to my 90s comics experience. I am just sort of sifting through, trying to find diamonds, the current detective run by a slightly reinvented Raphael Albuquerque. I quite like Ram V, who I've not read before, but I'm quite enjoying that, and I've got a couple of these other things. But you look at how many comics are published, and then you look at how many you're getting. Like, I'm like, hey, what a good week! I got 3 comics this week. And so out of the how many published a month? Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, no interest in continuity, or I'm just perfectly happy if someone's creating a little run on something that doesn't cross over with anything, and as soon as it does cross over, that's pretty much my jumping off point.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, it's like I had some interest in checking out the current run of Nightwing, but I didn't catch the first volume, and then the second volume was nothing but tie-ins to other Batman stuff. So it's like, well, I don't, even if I like the first volume, I'm going to have to skip the second volume because of all that crap. So why am I even going to try? I definitely feel that. But I've definitely become, I remember selling comics to the middle-aged guys who were mostly reading, off the beaten trail type of stuff, or legacy stuff, or out of continuity stuff. And I definitely grew up to become that guy. I do the same stuff. It's like, now I'm the guy who's like, oh, please give me the hardcover collection of short Wonder Woman stories with the cool textured cover and stuff. I think Superman Red and Blue is being solicited this month. That's definitely the kind of thing I'm going to want to pick up if I'm going to buy something from the majors. The only thing that I've bought recently that's actually in continuity, and I haven't started reading it yet, but the Philip Kennedy Johnson War World stuff in Action Comics. Because of my Mongol people, but not just that. Also, what I've read of his stuff has been pretty good. He seems like to be one of the up and coming guys that people like. You mentioned Ram V earlier. I read some of his Justice League Dark and was surprised, given how much I don't want to read a book like that, but I really enjoyed what I read of his. And if you're going to do dark horror, sorcery, Justice League, he seemed to do a really good job of pulling it off. And in particular, how he handled Wonder Woman within that context, which is not something I would have expected to be receptive to. But given her mythological background and some of the darker elements in the mythology, he managed to make it work. And it's like, wow, okay, this is the kind of writing that will get me to try stuff in continuity again. So there are always those guys where they're just a cut above, and it's like, okay, this guy, I'll make an exception for this guy. So, and Ram V would be one of those guys.
And it's I don't know about you, but I mean, I'm so happy that there's still these people who can drag me in a little bit, you know. Like Tom King, I'm hot and cold with.
Yeah, I'm a little over him right now because of the Human Target stuff is really pissing me off, and some of the other stuff he's done recently pissed me off.
What, as like an old JLA fan, or?
Yeah. But then Danger Street, where he's taking all the first issue special characters and doing something interesting with those, it's like, okay, you might have me on that one. I might actually.
Yeah, but you say that, but there's a bloke 15 years older than you saying I was fine with him until he started fucking with the first issue special characters. That was
right. Because of that long legacy of Lady Cop.
Exactly. You can't mess with that origin. That's gold.
Right.
But the Supergirl mini he did was it wasn't flawless. It sort of stumbled a little bit at the end for me, but it was beautiful and really, really well done.
Which is hilarious because I know Dr. Ange loves Supergirl and he did not love that miniseries. So he's the guy you just talked about on that particular. You're fucking with my character. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, going back to the aliens thing, you know, I'm quite happy to come in and take something at face value. Like, if you ask me what, like, I would have to work quite hard to go through all the Batman comics I've read and work out which ones I consider to be canon. And it might not go much further than like Batman Year One and a couple of Legends of the Dark Knight minis or something. But for the most part, I just don't care about continuity. I care when a character is completely fucked with, and it happens from time to time. I'm not super. I'm not super judgy. How can I put it? I'm not super analytical in the sense that I'm going to get too strung up on the character's motivations compared to their motivations 3 years ago or something. But every once in a while, I will get kicked hard out of something because of some ridiculous turn that a writer comes up with. And I can imagine Supergirl is nobody's Supergirl. It's his own thing, and should have been published as an Image series, Ultra Girl, and not offended anyone, you know, apart from the half a dozen people saying, oh, this should have been a Supergirl series. But
it's like the thing. I always complained throughout the 90s that the best Captain Marvel stories were all being told at other companies. You know, everybody was doing a better Shazam Captain Marvel than the actual Captain Marvel. So yeah, I can totally get that too.
Yeah, I mean, Supergirl. I mean, I don't know what that guy's go-to Supergirl is, but what's a go-to Supergirl anyway? You know, the Peter David Gary Frank, or the Silver Age, or the Golden, like
right. It is
it's
difficult.
Never the same.
Yeah, it's honestly, to some degree, Supergirl is the archetypical DC character because she's constantly being reinvented. It's like, well, do you like me now? Do you like me now? Do you like me now? You know. So yeah, I completely get where you're coming from on that one.
Yeah, her most famous cover, she's dead on it and being held by Superman.
Oh yeah. Oh, you're just twisting the knife on Ange now.
But yeah, I mean, I'm reading a bit, and I picked up this week. I picked up Batman versus Robin, which is Mark Waid and Mahmoud Asra, who did Conan actually. Yeah. And I presume that
and Dynamo 5.
Yeah, he's all right. But sort of going back to the Conan show that you just did the other day, I thought the 12 issue arc with Jason Aaron sort of played out really nicely, and then the King Conan mini as well, I thought was pretty great. So I don't know if you've got around to reading them since the podcast, but I would recommend them.
It's funny because it drives me nuts when we do ones with that kind of scope, because there's always stuff that gets missed, and so I'm always sitting back going, oh, I completely forgot about Raphael Kayanen's run on Conan the Adventurer and stuff like that. Yeah. But modern Marvel stuff, I'm almost completely avoid. Just because I've been divorced from the Marvel Universe since the early 90s, with a few exceptions. Like I kept up with Peter David's Hulk until near the end. But I was successfully able to like extricate myself from Marvel, probably because I was such an X-Men guy that once I'd lost interest in the X-Men, the greater Marvel Universe, I had an easy time.
Yeah.
Whereas DC just got their hooks into me so good, and there's so much about how that universe was structured after Crisis that it just I can't let it go. There's always going to be those elements. You were talking about like with artists. I've always been more writer first and then artist guy.
Sure.
But every time I see Dan Mora draw Dick Grayson as Robin in the World's Finest series, I don't know if that trade's been solicited yet, but I'm going to buy it just because I love how he draws that character. And I like Mark Waid too. Don't get me wrong, but that's what's roping me in. It's like I just want to watch him draw Dick Grayson for pages and pages and figure out somebody who's finally figured out how to do the Robin costume where it's still true to the original suit, but clearly an update and it isn't just Tim Drake's suit, which was great. But Tim Drake has the suit, and I like seeing Dick in a suit that actually works, that's flattering and makes use of the colors and makes use of the Robin Hood motif. And it's like that's a book I'm buying for the artwork whenever it comes out, or I'm grabbing that. So I'm definitely can be roped in by the artist too. I was so irritated because my comic box came really late this month, and I thought, well, surely I'm going to get the Alex Ross Fantastic Four then if I had to wait for so long, and then it wasn't in there.
In the UK yet.
Yeah, and I had all these great books, and it's like, but I didn't get the one I wanted. I didn't get my. That's the one I wanted to see. So then try it. So I definitely have the artists that will grab me sometimes too, and they'll be the deal maker for me. It's just that it's usually going to be a guy like Dan Moore is one of those few guys that like is definitely clearly a modern artist who's not from the 90s down. That it's like, man, that guy just knows how to draw these DC characters though, and then he just hasn't drawn a lot that was in my wheelhouse of interest to me. And then he's drawing Dick Grayson. Well, now I'm going to go check it out. Where you're talking about Batman versus Robin. Well, that's what's his face, Damian, and it's like, well, you've already lost me because it got Damian in it. It doesn't matter. It could be drawn by Paul Galassi or Steve Lytle could come back from the dead and draw it, and I still probably wouldn't pick it up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a Robin aficionado to the point that I have that kind of preference. I enjoy a bit of Dick Grayson in sort of throwback stories. Never read the Wolfman Perez Titans, for example, and then with Damien it came up from the Morrison stuff. So
it's like everybody read X-Men at some point.
Yeah,
but it's like if you were around for Wolfman Perez, everybody read it in that time period. But then it's like it's almost like been lost to time. It's like people who came later just never read it and have never gone back to it. And frankly, it doesn't hold up that great if you do go back to it. So it's like it's so important to people who read it when it was coming out, and it's like it just doesn't have the generational impact that something like X-Men ended up having because they were able to keep that momentum where Titans just didn't, just blew it basically.
And going back to like X-Men, what was your my X-Men journey was starting at Jim Lee, working back about 100 and so issues of Uncanny, and then I stuck with it through Lobdell and Ichizia, and then I got to Morrison, which I loved, the Joe Casey stuff less so, and then I sort of struggled a little bit. I read a bit of the Bacallo, the Mike Carey stuff was surprisingly good, but I was still struggling with the fact that it was tying into other stuff, so reading 2 out of 4 parts of a story got a bit tedious, and then that was me like done. I was finished. And so now when like House of X, Powers of 10, whatever it is, have you read it?
Nope. Again, getting back to the weird lettering kink of mine, when Hickman came in and decided everything had to be digital, like looking like a digital clock, all the fonts had to be looking like digital. I was just like, nope. But no, there was never any danger of me reading that stuff because for me, when I was starting to read the X-Men comic books was tail end of Cockrum and Paul Smith, was the stuff that was out there, and I reached back for John Byrne, and then thanks to X-Men Classic, I reached all the way back to the early Cockrum stuff, and sort of I have a gap period where the second run of Cockrum I just didn't have a lot of interest in and didn't read a lot of that stuff. But skipping through that, basically from All New X-Men through until a year or two after the Image Exodus, and then that was the end of it for me. My break point was Fatal Attractions.
Or Age of Apocalypse? Fatal
Attractions. Yeah, it was just around that time where like, okay, X-Force was one of the ones I still liked because I thought Fabian Nicieza was one of the better writers, and I loved Greg Capullo's artwork when he had that more Michael Golden quality to it.
Oh, it was amazing that period of
Capullo. And his last period was his last issue was X-Force number 25, so that was an easy drop. I never liked the Kubert boys on X-Men, so I had already dropped that several months prior to that issue. Uncanny, I think, was it Tom Rainey who did the tie-in to Fatal Attractions? Anyway, I liked the Scott Lovedale stuff okay. And
it was John Romita Jr., Jay Lee.
Oh yeah, John Romita Jr. had come back, and that's
funny.
Yeah, that was weird because obviously he was the odd man out in that group. And as much as I liked John Romita Jr., I just wasn't enjoying the stories by the time, because you had that period where Brandon Peterson was drawing Uncanny, and I just loathed his artwork at that time. I could not stand it. And the stories seemed to like kind of fall off around 290 something, whatever. They had Tom Rainey do it for a little bit, and then after he had left and Portasio had left, they did the one with Strife. I can't remember the name of it now.
Yeah, Executioner Song.
Yeah. And so that was me sort of going, okay, I'm about done with this. And so Fatal Attractions just seemed like the natural jumping off points, and so many of the people I liked were leaving. John Romita Jr. was the only one coming back, but because I didn't enjoy the stories anymore, I just left. And with the exception of coming back for when Claremont came back briefly with Lanil Francis Yu late in the decade, I just successfully was able to cold turkey on that. There's, like I've said, there's some stuff that I had to go back over and over again and still has a bit of a pull for me. But for some reason, I'd read so many X-Men comic books for so many years, and I read so much material that I did not enjoy really starting with X-Men number 1, because I was disappointed when I bought that, and it's like, it looks good, but I don't really like the story. And then I bought it for almost 2 years after not liking that story and not really liking any of the stories from that volume. Then they just like slowly eroded my affection, and recognized that the things I loved about X-Men, like the fact that the lineups were always changing and there were always people coming in and going out, and now you got this group that's just static for like 5 years straight because they're the ones that
I think the cartoon did it, no? They just locked into that Jim Lee lineup.
Yeah, exactly. And so I realized, okay, the thing that made me keep buying this book is gone now, which was Claremont, which is funny too, because I was sick of Claremont until Jim Lee came on. All that, the tail end of Mark Silvestri, and then all the fill-in guys when they were due bi-weekly in the summers and stuff.
Yeah, 250, 260s.
Yeah, I wasn't into, and again, sorry, Leonardo was doing a lot of those fill-ins too. And then I got back into it because of the Jim Lee material, and then it's like, okay, well, that was like this last hurrah. That was a great send-off. It's time for me to go to. I lost you. I think you got muted.
Yeah.
Okay.
That run of Uncanny you're talking about, there's a run of Uncanny X-Men from the back end of like Uncanny 290 through to until about Joe Madureira starts, to be honest.
Which was great too. I loved looking at that, so I just didn't feel compelled to read it, but I loved looking at it.
No, I mean the writing's pretty terrible, but I mean he sells it well. But that run of comics from like that terrible Wills cover with like Storm looking up at the sky getting rained on, through to like Brandon Peterson, there's a cover where it's got like Professor X standing over himself under a tree. There's a run of covers that gives me the opposite of like a Proustian buzz. Like I see it, and it sort of makes my stomach sink a little bit at having ever read them.
Right, like you're embarrassed for having bought them and being like, oh, this is the thing I want to read. Yeah.
Yeah,
been there.
The fact that like Marvel hasn't retconned them the way they did like the reprint. Like get John Byrne to come and write a 10-issue story that fills in that gap or something. It's so fucking bad. Brandon Peterson was just he actually got okay afterwards.
Oh, I really enjoy his work today, and I have enjoyed it since he what was it? What was the book that he started drawing in his more current style?
It was like a Top Cow book, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think you're right. Oh, well, yeah, because when he started on Codename Strike File, he was still doing his crappy wannabe Jim Lee, yeah. And then by the time he did Witchblade Spawn, Medieval Spawn Witchblade, that was really good looking stuff, and I've enjoyed his stuff since then. He's not remotely prolific, but it was like, for instance, that was the only good thing about the J. Michael Straczynski Doctor Strange wannabe reboot, was it looked great, it just read for shit.
Yeah, and that Medieval Spawn Witchblade, that was like, he did like two and a bit issues of that, and the rest were like Top Cow people. It was a real...
cover. I bought it. I don't remember if he.
So you got that lovely cover. You got a great Aaron Wiesenfeld strip of like a pin-up of Spawn and Witchblade versus a giant wooden robot thing. But my main memory of it is basically by issue 3, it's drawn by, I don't know, Anthony Wynn and inked by 25 people or something.
Oh, Jesus!
He jumped off for the 3rd issue, so I don't own it because it's too painful when that happens.
I read each of those issues as they came out the one time, put them in a box, and I guess probably sold them at some point because I don't have them in my possession anymore. But
surely they're going to come up in your reread.
Oh, eventually, yeah. But it's just you're just like, oh, great! I get to look forward to Anthony Wynn. And again, this is what's so great about talking with somebody like you. Is like you've dropped an Aaron Wiesenfeld reference twice now. What are the fucking odds? It's like, okay, well, I know I'm dealing with a contemporary for certain.
I mean, he's just he's just brilliant. Like watching that guy was like watching a fucking Roman candle.
Yeah, is he the one who did the Death Blow Wolverine 2-part miniseries?
Yeah, so he did Team 7, and like that Team 7, if you like Team 7, he goes from doing that like Kinetic, Jim Lee. So he was X of Continuity along with Richard Bennett, and then did Team 7 after doing a couple of issues of Cable and an X-Men annual. And then on Team 7, he actually had decent colours, and he was inked by Scott Williams and JD, who was like Scott Williams' protege or whatever. So it looked okay, but in 4 issues, he grew so much. And then he did the 2-issue Deathblow Wolverine. He did a few pages on Alan Moore Wildcats. He did a Batman black and white painted story with Joe Kelly, and then fucked off and left us. And it was just like, oh my god, what happened there? It was like more than Travis Charest.
You're right. That's exactly what I was thinking of when you're talking about that. Is one of these guys who just like had this extraordinary evolution and then just fucking vanishes. Yeah. And what's so sad about Travis Charest too, or I think it's actually like something like Charvet or something.
Yeah, I think it's Charvet.
But somebody told me, and then I was like, okay, I got to remember that, and then I've completely forgotten what they told me was the actual pronunciation. I'm saying Charest until
doesn't matter.
At least we know what we're talking about.
Sienkiewicz, who cares?
Right. But as I recognize that on a technical level, he's a better artist now, but his current work in no way interests me. It just looks like another one of these digital painter guys, and it just doesn't stand out in any way to me. Where there was a time where it's just like, wow, this guy's got some of the best stuff of Kevin Nolan mixed with Jim Lee, mixed with Mike Mignola, and I love all this stuff. And now it's just like, I probably couldn't pick him out of a lineup the way he draws now, or paints, or whatever he's doing, what technique he's using.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen a few pages. I think I tweeted a few pages from his, because he's got a Mark Millar project coming up, and there was a bit. So after he did Wildcats 25, he disappeared for a few issues, and then came back doing a few pages here and there on Wildcats. And those Wildcats pages were just breathtaking. I don't know if you remember, there was like a double-page spread with like an aeroplane in a hangar, and it was just an aeroplane, but he drew it so well. It was amazing. And then Wildcats X-Men Golden Age and the Wildcats series afterwards, all great, but you could see like him trailing off in terms of input. And then the current stuff, like his covers that he's doing, he's obviously all digital at this point, and he's found a method that maybe makes him more productive. So I don't know about you. Like, okay, here's a comparison for you. Would you want Red Nails Once in a Lifetime, or no Red Nails and a load of Archer and Armstrong by Barry Windsor Smith? And the answer is, if what you've got to take is Red Nails and then he does some shit Archer and Armstrong, you'll live with it, right? And that's what we've got with Travis.
Well, the ideal route is you get Red Nails, he disappears for the better part of a decade, then he comes back and he's doing Weapon X and the Uncanny X-Men and all that kind of Monster. You want to see the culmination of that, and the culmination should be him excelling and becoming an all-timer, and instead he just vanishes and he comes back and he becomes another anonymous drone, doing variant covers and shit. That's not the arc you want to have for your career. You're better off being Aaron Wiesenfeld, where you leave us tantalized, like, wow, I wonder what happened to that guy. Because I don't know. Do you know what became of him? I remember that he had that really great European influence style in those 2 issues, and everybody was praising it, and then he's just gone.
No, he's a proper painter. He actually follows me on Twitter, and I feel slightly self-conscious whenever tweet something about his great comics, because I feel like he's somewhere like with his toes curling in a room, deciding whether to unfollow me or not. But he did covers. You know that Kelly Jones, Steve Seagal series Crusades. He did the last 8 issue of covers for that, and that was like the style that he landed on, and then went off to do fine art.
That was a cliffhanger book, right?
No, it was Vertigo. It was
Vertigo. Okay.
Yeah, it was Kelly Jones on the art. So it was Kelly Jones. I can't remember who was inking it, but I don't think it was great. It was like a knight trapped in modern times. But yeah, you made me laugh earlier talking about Barry Windsor Smith making everyone look sleepy, and it made me think of the guy I used to work with in Gosh, and he said that Mark Texeira, everyone he draws looks like cats. And I was like, what? And I can't get away from it. It's like I can't remove that memory. Every time I see Mark Texeira, I'm like, yeah, they do look a bit like cats. They do look a bit
like cats, it's true. Yeah. Everybody's got that evil, gigantic grin. You know, they're all little Cheshire people. Yeah. But I love Texeira. He's one of my favorites. He doesn't quite get where he used to be, unfortunately, anymore. But I still love the stuff. But yeah, but they also totally look like cats.
Did you see he did a Yosemite Sam Jonah Hex one shot?
I didn't pick that one up, but I remember seeing him doing the cover. I wasn't sure if he did the interiors on that, but I didn't put the money down on it. How did that turn out?
Yeah, no, it's fine. I mean, like most of those things, like this is the problem that I have with a lot of the comics I buy nowadays, is that I read them once and then I can pretty much tell straight away that I'm never going to be interested in reading them again. So if they're Marvel, I redeem the code, so I've got them digitally at least. But most of the stuff I buy, I read once and then sell on. But there was the Batman Elmer Fudd was great. There was a really nice Kelly Jones, Wile E. Coyote, Lobo, Wile E. Coyote, which was like mental but gorgeous. It was Bill Morrison writing and Kelly Jones on the art, and then the Texeira one, I think it was written by Jimmy Palmiotti or something. So it's fine, you know.
Of course, you know, being a mental, I did pick up the Martian Manhunter, Marvin the Martian one, but I still haven't gotten around to reading it. So I ought to, but it's one of those things where after doing daily blogging on Martian Manhunter for all those years, it's really hard to like, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to read this. I'm going to write up a synopsis of it. And I can't just read it to just read it. You know, I can't just read it for the pure pleasure of the act of reading. It has to be for something. So I do have that one, but I never did anything with it. It looks fun though. I want to check out more of Mark Russell's stuff. I hear so many good things about him, and he did one of those. So yeah, I need to check his stuff out. What have you read of his?
I read the Flintstones, which was I think the first thing that he did. I read one of those crossovers he did, the DC Warner ones, and then I just read that Superman thing with Allred. That was worth the hype. That was really good.
I'm trading waiting on that one, but it's hard because there's such thick volumes, and I know they're not coming out on a routine basis. It's like, why don't I just go buy the individual ones, you know, because it looks so in my wheelhouse. That looks so great.
Yeah, I hadn't even picked up on the because I wasn't interested in it before it came out, and then as it was coming out, it was like it's like 80 pages of Mike Allred for $10 or something, so £9, and it's Mark Russell who I really like, so it seemed like a no-brainer by the time it came out. But Mike Allred's not someone he doesn't excite me. I've got comics by him that I love, like the early Madmans and things, but he's not someone who excites me to the point that I see something solicited and jump up and down. But by the time this came out, it had sort of bubbled under to the point where it's like, I buy so few comics, fuck it, I'll just pick it up, and I really liked him.
Yeah, I love Mike Allred's art style, but he's one of those guys, like you're talking about how, hold on one second. Sorry, I didn't want to make noise. He's one that, like you talked about Chuck Dixon being a guy who you like if he's got the right artist.
Yeah.
And I think that Chuck Dixon is a great writer on certain characters, and ideally he's always a great artist, but usually he works with his buddies, and I don't like most of his buddies. So that's my issue with him. One of my guys is Ron Mars, where on his own, I could give a shit about Ron Mars. But he's one of these guys who is respectable enough continuity that if he would just write a character I love, regardless of the art, as long as the art's not actively off-putting, I would buy Ron Mars' stuff because he's not going to piss me off. He's good enough. And so with a character I love, good enough was good enough for a long time there. So with Mike Allred, my thing is I really like his artwork, but I'm not going to buy it if it's a character that I don't have an interest in. And I lost interest in Madman because I like his writing okay, but it's not the way he was writing the book wasn't to my taste in that time period. Maybe I would like it if I revisited it. But I would enjoy seeing him on stuff. Like he did a Doctor Strange miniseries with Dead Girl a while back, and I enjoyed picking that up because I like Doctor Strange. But when you're going to have a long run on Silver Surfer, I could give a shit about Silver Surfer. So it doesn't matter how praised it is. I'm just not going to be there for it. But with Superman, and it's not like I have like a passion for Silver Age Superman stories. What I have a passion about is continuity, and that Superman in that time period was one of the most popular characters published, and far and away the top superhero in that time period. And then when John Byrne decided that stuff was corny and we're not going to do anything with it anymore, all that stuff got abandoned. And for me, that's an essential part of Superman. When I was growing up and they would show Superman's origin, you'd have the guy with the green headband on and stuff. That's even though I didn't read the Silver Age comic books, the iconography was still a part of my upbringing, and that lore I know impacted on my initial interpretation of who Superman was. And when they took all that stuff away, when they took away a lot of that sci-fi stuff and the science fantasy stuff, I don't feel like the character that was left had the robust qualities of a Superman. It just felt like this diminished, marvelized version of the character. Yeah. And so when, like an Ed McGuinness, even though Jeff Loeb, who I can't stand, but when Jeff Loeb decided he was going to bring in that Silver Age stuff and Ed McGuinness is drawing it, it's like, yes, give me that. And seeing Mike Allred do that Silver Age stuff, yes, give me that. Take my money. So, you chalk it to fetishization. For me, I think it's just remembering that lore was there, remembering that the full mythology of Superman should be accessible to modern creators, and seeing that it gives me hope that, okay, maybe one of these days we can have the full Superman experience, and not just this guy whose cape has to get torn and has to sweat and, that kind of thing. I get tired, like there's a lot of people who tell me about, oh, you got to watch Superman and Lois. And it's like, I want to see him hanging out on a farm and all this domestic stuff, and his kids are probably the stars of the show and shit. It's like, no. Yeah. I want to see a Superman.
The best, like for me, I'm not a mad Superman guy at all. But for me, my entry point to Superman, I mean, obviously I read Whatever Happens to the Man of Tomorrow. I read What You Get from Man. I read the Alan Moore stuff, basically. But I never read any, well, firstly, back issues of Superman and Batman were never big in the UK. You couldn't easily come across. But once the film of Batman came out, all the back issues dried up. And Superman, I don't know if the interest wasn't there or if people weren't letting them go, but they were just never around. So it wasn't really an option for me to pick up any given run. And then nobody could ever say, oh, you know what you want to get is Superman 745 there was no frame of reference like it was with Batman of like Batman Year One, followed by Grant and Brayfogle, followed by, it's just like, Kurt Swan and loads of people that drew like him for 100 years. So I never read any old Superman. There were no collections. And then Mr. Majestic by Joe Casey and McGuinness. That was like, oh, well, fucking hell, this is really good,
Another instance of everybody doing a version of the Silver Age Superman. Scream by Alan Moore, another example where, that's how you could do good Superman stories. We're not going to do those. We're going to do our tepid bullshit by comics by committee bullshit.
Yeah, I don't know what Brian Hoglin's contribution to that was, because he's co-writer with Joe Casey, but that idea of like, so Superman, there's something coming, it's going to be here in about 25 years, so that's why you're not getting involved in Vietnam, and that's why you're not getting involved in the Gulf, like taking Superman off the table because he's busy building rings around Uranus instead of Saturn and stuff. I mean, just like massive level sci-fi superhero stuff that probably couldn't be done in a regular ongoing continuity.
Yeah, and that is the real problem, is that the rest of the DC universe doesn't work if Superman's in it. So I get it. I get the rationale. But you're not really that super then, are you? that's like, okay, you can hang out with Wonder Woman and Batman now, but what are you bringing to the table besides the iconography? That's the issue I have with it.
Yeah, and then you have so Alan Moore does it well. Alan Moore kind of seems to accidentally wander in and almost ruin characters by nailing them so much that nobody else can ever really add anything to them. Mark Millar tries to do the same thing. Like Mark Millar, there's a couple of moments in that Wolverine miniseries that make me just want to punch him in the face hard. What one is the thing of like that Mr. Fantastic, he makes that terrible stretching noise when he stretches, and Johnny Storm, he smells like burning hair or whatever, and he's just like, oh, fuck off. And then he has a thing later on where like between issue 9 and 10 or something, he says something like Wolverine has killed 9,000 1,000 ninjas, and you're just like, really, off panel, you know? And is that what Wolverine does now? He kills 9,000, really? And it's just like Millar trying to up his. I think he's gone on to be a better writer than he was at the time when he was most popular. But yeah, he comes in and tries to do those moments, and Grant Morrison does the thing where he does like the Alan Moore thing of having like one tiny line be a thing that nails a character forever. And Grant Morrison's pretty good at doing similar type stuff. And Mark Millar feels like I can do that, and just doesn't just constantly goes through sort of fucking characters up a bit. But that might just be me.
No, I think you 100% nailed it. I think that you read something that Alan Moore writes, like sometimes it's even an offhand thing, and he makes you want to explore. He makes you want to read more, spend more time with his character. Where I think Miller's like a bad Tinder date or something, where it's like you after about 5-10 minutes you don't want to have anything to do with this character that he's writing. You know, how quickly can I get out of this fucking thing? You know, so yeah, and again the try hard. He's just trying so hard to be Pat Mills, and he's not Alan Moore, he's not Pat Mills, he's not Grant Morrison. He can be okay when he's doing himself, but himself wasn't commercial. Because if you look at stuff like when he did the Superman Adventures book, I know a lot of people love that stuff. And when he's working on a character that he has genuine affection for, and
that's
he can't bring himself,
is,
when he can't bring himself to fuck it up, that's the Miller I like. Like he did the Legacy, the Jupiter's Circle miniseries with Wilfredo Torres.
Yeah.
And he was basically again doing something similar to what James Robinson was doing with Starman. And it's like, why don't we see that guy more often? I like what you're doing here. I like these stories you're telling. You're telling more adult, sophisticated stuff with these childhood archetype, but it's good. It's not just like, making everything. He's just like a Coke and whores kind of writer when he's trying to be commercial. And my appetite for Coke and whores is pretty limited, especially at this point in my life. But he thinks that that's the thing. He's got that lad mad mentality. He thinks that's what people want, and he's not wrong because that's what his commercial.
That is what they want.
But it has a limited appeal, and obviously he isn't the light that he used to be because I think the zeitgeist has just kind of moved on from that, and he's not, and he doesn't know how to be another thing a lot of the time. So now he is just the poor man's third-rate Grant Morrison, you know.
Well, I think with him, I don't read everything that he writes, but there was a point, and I think it was maybe MPH that he did with Duncan Fegredo, who, like, not name dropping, but he's a mate of mine.
Cool.
But he's someone who can act, you know, not from panel to panel, but within a panel. So he's not reliant on action and reaction to create an emotion. He can actually do stuff in a panel on its own, you know. And MPH had a surprising amount of heart to it, and I don't know if it's like off the back of Millar's kind of brush with death that he had. Like he was really ill for a while, and I think MPH might have been one of the first things that came out the back of that. But since then, he's done quite a good Reborn that he did with Capullo was really good, and Magic Order was really good, and the one that he did with Goran Parlov about like the aging Flash Gordon, like almost like Flash Gordon meets Unforgiven would probably be
so like Starlight or something. I think
Starlight.
So.
There you go. Yeah. Those were all like surprisingly strong character pieces that didn't have the old Millar kind of loaded magazine sort of flair to them. So if you come across them in a library or cheap or something, I'd recommend them. But Reborn for me is quite painful because all the work that Capullo's, I really like Capullo, and all the work that he's done since he's come back has been with Scott Snyder, whose work I don't get on with. And then he does this Reborn miniseries, which is really nice, and then fucks off back to Snyder again.
One thing you got to give Capullo credit for, though, he is loyal. When he works with you, when he has an artistic collaboration with you, it's going to last for years and years, it seems like.
Yeah. Did you listen to the Kevin Smith, who I don't have much time for, but he's Fat Man on Batman podcast. He did, like, it was 2 episodes that were Greg Capullo, and from your perspective, i.e. from our perspective, they're fucking fascinating. Really, really good.
Cool.
And it's Capullo talking about getting into comics, about Larry Hama. I think it was Larry Hama sort of trying to fuck him over on something, and then a couple of years later, because of the Image Exodus, he's sitting at the big boys table at the X-Men convention or the X-Men power meeting or whatever, and he's like, "Hey Larry, look, it's me." And, and this kind of stuff.
Not to be petty, but.
Yeah. But he goes on to talk about how like he hit a bad time with like drink and maybe drugs, and how McFarlane was basically throwing him a bone and just giving him like a lifeline, doing like production designs and stuff. Like when he couldn't turn in a monthly comic.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. I did not know that. I know because he'd done like I know he left to do like the Creech, and then he had those wilderness years where I didn't know what he was doing, and I've never researched it, so it didn't occur to me. Oh, there was some personal problem stuff there. Okay, now okay, that sorry, it's just like when you mention that, it's just like a light bulb was like, oh, you just answered a question I didn't know that I wanted to ask. So it's like, oh, okay, I get it now.
Yeah, no, it's a really good interview because it's like so what you like about Kevin Smith, you know that you can be kind of gloves off and there's no sort of editorial going on. So he's quite candid and quite sort of sweary, and talks about how he landed on the style that he did and got traveling in from wherever he was from, so like some sort of shithole New Jersey way, traveling in to drop off his samples at Marvel and stuff like that. Like he's probably one of the last people of that kind of era,
right?
And it's really interesting, and like I say, it goes on forever. It's like 2 hours long. But yeah, I've got a lot of time for Capullo. Maybe not his self-image with his with his biceps and
right. Yeah, that's I find that equally off-putting. So, but yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned that to me because Kevin Smith's one of those guys where I can't be mad at him because I think he's genuinely a good, decent person and stuff. But he also, and he's a fan, obviously, and he knows the same stuff we know about. But he's just
no, he doesn't. That's the problem.
Oh yeah.
Sorry.
Oh yeah.
He doesn't.
Okay.
He's a lot more. He's a lot less into it than you think.
Okay.
You know, they didn't realize Capullo was doing Batman until like 30 issues into it or something. He mentions within the interview.
Okay.
And there's things that he says of like, oh, and who was inking that or whatever, where you realise that he's not as dialed into it as you assume that he is. But sorry, I cut you off.
No, valid though. Yeah, he definitely has that dilettante quality, and like you said, there's a lack of depth. But my main thing is just the lack of ambition. It's like he's just such a superficial person most of the time, and even when he tries to do something deep for him, that's like the surface level for so many other creative people. That it's like, oh, really? That's as far as you can go. That's as deep as you can go. Is okay, sure. So I can't hate him. I can't get really mad at him, but I wouldn't qualify myself as a fan either. But occasionally, like you said, he'll stumble upon something where it's like, oh, this is a value. You've stumbled onto something like probably Capullo would not be somebody who would do well in like a really intense interview environment. But I would assume that if you're hanging out bullshitting, maybe smoking some pot, knowing Smith, that might loosen you up and you might get something out of that you wouldn't get otherwise. So I'm glad you turned me on to that one.
Yeah, well, and there's a few good ones. He interviews Neil Adams. I think there's a Jim Lee one. There's a Joe Quesada one, which is a sort of a two-parter, but the second part for some reason took ages to come out and then did eventually. But it felt like there was some weird sort of disconnect there, like he'd been told by Marvel or something not to put it out. Or I don't know. But did you know the story about Joe Quesada and
Jimmy Palmiotti?
Well, no. I'll fill me in on that in a second. Joe Quesada basically getting told by DC that he'd never get any Batman work because of Wizard.
That sounds vaguely familiar. Go ahead, though.
You know that cover where it's like Asbat's in complete silhouette on Wizard?
Yeah.
And it's just got like a little kind of a belt buckle and it's like complete silhouette and it's just got little bits on it. Basically, Wizard told Joe Quesada that they'd been given the go-ahead to publish his cover with Asbat's on it. And so Joe Quesada drew it and then DC got wind of it, put the kibosh on it, told Wizard that they had to edit it, and then told Joe Quesada that because he betrayed this unspoken non-disclosure agreement, that he'd never work on Batman again. He was like, well, the only thing I want to work on here is Batman, so I guess I'll go and work at Marvel or do my own thing. And that's why we got Sword of Azrael, a load of covers, and then nothing else from Joe Quesada at DC.
That's interesting, but I'd always worked under the assumption that it's like, oh, well, you guys, it's just like with most of the Image guys, is they start out at DC, they stay there until they become hot, and then they go to some place where they can actually pay them properly. So I just assumed that he did those covers for a little while there, and then I assumed that Valiant was paying more money, and he just went over there. But to know that DC shot themselves in the foot to spite themselves,
getting rid of the only image artist that they had.
Right.
Or the only image caliber.
Yeah. Well, he could have been. That's one of the things that was always weird with Quesada is that they should have never had event studios. He should have just been one of the image guys. I think that would have been beneficial to their careers and beneficial to their sales, and it would have given a feather in the cap to Image at a time where I think they could have used it. And instead, he was one of the fill-in guys who, like, sort of like not a scab, but he was one of the guys that hung on when everybody else had left and still helped to keep up the momentum of these other publishers. And I realized too that he was kind of coming up in the time period where Image was mismanaging where they were cutting ties with all those creators because your books are too late, blah, blah, blah. And obviously, Quesada wasn't a timely guy either. But yeah, it is kind of a shame. I mean, it's not really a shame. I think things worked out perfectly fine for Joe. But it's too bad that, the event was like this blip that comes and goes, because I think the animosity between him and Palmiotti is such that you're never going to see anything come out of that ever again. And I'm sure.
So do you know anything about that? Do you know have you got any sort of rumors around why was it just because Quesada got the editorial chief? That's the assumption, right?
I think that's a reasonably safe assumption, because they were fine together with Marvel Knights and everything until he got the EIC tap. And I think that one of the major issues was that Palmiotti wanted to be able to continue to do stuff with Event. And knowing that Joe would be tied up with Marvel for years, like, okay, well, let me do some Ash stuff. Let me do 22 Brides and all this other, what's Painkiller Jane. And, let me maintain the Event while you go off and do your Marvel thing. And I think Joe said, no, you're not doing anything without me. And so all that stuff just withered on the vine. And Jimmy Palmiotti had to basically start from scratch creatively. Plus, because of the personal animosity with Joe, I don't even think he was doing a lot of inking work at Marvel. He started working at other companies. So, but I think ultimately it comes down to Joe Quesada telling him no and letting him kind of fend for himself as a result of that.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, because Palmiotti, that's been an interesting career post Marvel Knights. Like, I think he's sort of co-written some interesting stuff with Justin Gray. I don't know what the dynamic is with them two, but I think he's a pretty terrible inker, to be honest.
It depends on who he's working with, but
what have you seen him good on? Because even on Quesada, it feels like, because he's fine on Quesada, but Joe Quesada's also better with almost everyone else.
I never liked Danny Miki on Quesada. So for starters, not being Danny Miki is already a plus. I liked his Sienkiewicz lift, because for a while there, he was inking Sal Buscema with that Sienkiewicz line, and I think he might have also done some of the Aparo stuff, but Aparo had actual Sienkiewicz for some of that stuff too. So I liked when he was doing that. He's never been like an exemplar for me. I've never been like, oh man, why don't you get Jimmy Palmiotti for this? But I don't remember him doing a lot of stuff where I was like, man, he's ruining this book. So more of a journeyman in that respect. But I like him as a person. I like his mentality. He's got that long relationship with Amanda Connor, and I think that speaks well to him, because I think they're both cool people. And while I never got into their Jonah Hex series, when I would dip into, usually I'd buy the standalone stories, one issue where they'd get a Gull AC, or the one where they got Jordy Bernay, when they would get an interesting artist to come in, I'd read it, and I liked it. I just never felt strongly enough about it to read their stuff. But people really loved their Jonah Hex series, and I thought that their quality revival stuff at DC was all right. He's not going to make any of my fan favorite lists.
Freedom Fighters.
Yeah. Well, and then they also, in the New 52, they did the cycle where they were doing one-shots to try to reintroduce New 52 versions of them. So, they did a new Ray, they did a new Human Bomb, stuff like that.
Uncle Sam, whatever.
Yeah. He's another one of these guys where if he were working on something that I had an interest in, that I'd probably be okay with him, but he almost never does. So he's not going to make my top 10 list or anything, but I don't dislike him either. He just seems like an all right guy, but a bit of a journeyman for me.
Yeah. No, it's fair enough. And then he's not working with Justin Gray anymore either, and that's it's something.
Justin Gray isn't working though, so it's I don't know if that's a falling out or it's just the work drive.
He's gone to Hollywood or something.
Yeah. I mean,
staff writer or something.
Yeah, I think he was. I want to say, wasn't he working in advertising or something, or wasn't he doing some sort of magazine work or something? I think maybe it was just a matter of they weren't getting hired as a writing combo anymore, and so he just kept working on other things. Yeah, I don't think.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't heard anything. It's not like an Andy Lanning kind of Dan Abnett situation where it's like we all want to know what the fuck happened with that situation. Those guys.
After 30 years or 40 years or something.
And neither one of them have talked about it either. It's like, man, who slept with whose wife? What happened there, man?
Davis and Farmer have broken up.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so Davis and Farmer was a sad one because basically Farmer turned up at a con to find that he'd been sat separate from Davis without knowing why. And then when he dug into it, it turned out to be, it was basically a scheduling thing. He was supposed to be inking something for Davis that had been delayed. And so some editor at Marvel had given Farmer another inking job. And then David, and apparently that's what the falling out was about. Like something as mundane as that after middle of Excalibur 50 or something like Excalibur 40 or whatever that was.
Yeah.
So that was like a 20-year long partnership, and that's now dissolved. And Davis has gone back to inking his own work, sadly. But yeah, that kind of thing that's fucking sad. Like I'm pretty sure we'll see more Jim Lee, Scott Williams work because those two they got, aside from maybe one of them wanting to pack it in or slow down, they got no reason to stop working together, I think.
Yeah. Well, and I think Williams probably needs to work more as well since Jim Lee's got the whole corporate job to fall back on. So I'm sure he's okay with his money, where freelance inker without a staff job, can you kick me something, Jim,
Yeah. How long before, I mean, if Jim Lee doesn't keep drawing, how long before Scott Williams turns up inking X-Men or something again?
Well, that's just it. I wish, go ahead, do that, but they've really abandoned, I'm more in the loss of letterers. I miss hand lettering, and the more, it's like the same 3 or 4 guys seem to letter everything nowadays, and so it all has that same character, and you don't have like a Todd Klein anymore, you don't have a John Workman anymore, and then with inking, there are all these guys that I used to love, and there were art teams that I'm just not as interested in the artist without that particular inker, and they're just not there anymore because nobody's getting anything inked hardly anymore.
Yeah,
and you mentioned Greg Capullo. At least he's still got Jonathan Clapion, who does decent work over him. He's not necessarily my favorite over Capullo, but he does solid work over him.
Yeah, well, the Clapion one's weird because he was Tony Daniels inker, wasn't he? I think he was at Extreme, and then I thought that he was Tony Daniels inker on Spawn and Blood Feud and things. But Capullo, when he first came he did 50 odd issues of Batman. The first 10 or 11 Court of Owls were with Glapion, and then all the rest were Danny Mickey.
Oh yeah, I didn't catch that. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
because I'm not. I don't.
Everything since is Glapion.
Okay, weird. Yeah.
So I'm not quite. I don't know. I don't know if that's DC saying, well, Danny Mickey's our house style or something. Because John Romita. So Dean White was telling me that John Romita Jr. wanted him to color Batman, Superman Year One, and Miller was like, no. I want the best. I want Jim Lee's colorist. And Jim Lee's colorist, Alex Sinclair, can only color Jim Lee. Everything else he colors looks fucking dreadful. So you got Frank Miller, John Romita Jr. with Danny Mickey inks. What? Alex Sinclair colors. Oh shit. And that book, like if it had been inked by Jansen, colored by Dean White, to this day I'd still be on the fence as to whether I liked it or not. But because the art is so fucked up in the last 2 parts of the process, I'm quite happy to say that it was a bit of a shit show.
Yeah, Miller. Miller's another guy. You look at his Batman work. Alan Moore. Nobody wants to follow Alan Moore because he does such a great job with the characters, and he's just smarter than so many of the people in the industry. That when you try to follow him, it just seems like a fool's errand. Where Miller, it's funny because he was so inspirational, but you can do Miller. You can like kind of you may not do it as well as Miller.
Many have,
but many have and have been quite successful in doing so. So he's an attainable level of quality and was very inspirational. But man, I don't know what happened to him. Again, I haven't gone to look into it too much, but like it's just reverse Midas touch now. And I wanted nothing to do with Superman Year One. Just looking at, now he's going to be the military and he's going to be a soldier, part of a Black Ops unit. It's like, no, fuck you. And really, even since Dark Knight Returns, I've known that I really wasn't the audience for a Frank Miller Superman anyway, because he expressed such contempt for that character in one of his signature works that it's like, I know plenty of people, Michael Bailey, chief among them, will point to that miniseries as the downfall of Superman and how Superman has never been able to be taken seriously as a character by a large percentage of the audience and the talent because of Dark Knight Returns. So yeah, I knew that was going to be a shit show, and from everything I heard, it absolutely was. So this is no surprise to me what you're telling me. Plus, let's be honest, like, look, he's also the guy who was defending Varley's coloring on Dark Knight Strikes Back, and you know, I mean, I don't know if you were on message boards in that time period, but nobody was on board with that shit.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to say that Dark Knight Strikes Back was one of those books that I was like, there aren't many things like it insofar as, generally speaking, I'll read something, I'll put it down and I'll have an opinion. Occasionally I'll read it again years later and change that opinion. Dark Knight Strikes Back was a book that I read, and then by the end of it I was like, I don't know if I liked that or hated it, and I carried that with me long enough that at some point I decided that was in its favor. Like, if it neither pushes my buttons and pleases me and gives me a massage, nor does it offend me like so terribly, then there's something there. And then slowly it's worked its way in, and actually I'm really quite fond of it at this point. And color wise, I think that I would sort of stand up. I certainly didn't like them at the time. I'd have been firmly in that camp. But at this point in time, with so much stuff looking really homogenous, and even looking like pleasantly homogenous, you know, like inoffensively homogenous. There was a period of time when it was liquid and everything looked like shit.
Yeah.
But at this point in time, there's like, what type of colours are we going to get? We're going to get Dave Stewart-y colours, or we're going to get pastel-y colours, or everything feels of a kind. And you certainly can't say that of Dark Knight Strikes. So
true.
I think it's aged well in that sense, because there's nothing else that looks like it. But I mean, that's not, I wouldn't defend it. It's not something I've tried to defend to anybody else. I'm fine with it. You know,
I haven't reread it since it was being released. I remember though, I liked it so much that because we ran short on the first couple of issues because the demand was high, I read them and I was like, okay, well, I'll go ahead and sell my personal copies. And then by the third one, thankfully, because I think it came late, I was able to return those because I didn't need to sell my personal copy. I had plenty left over of that third issue. But I just never felt a desire to revisit it, because it was another one of those deals where it's like, bad sequel, don't go home, you can never go home again kind of thing. The only thing I remember liking was the Adam in the Petri dish, Savage Land Adam basically in the Petri dish.
That was the best bit of the book.
Yeah. And then I think about Superman and Wonder Woman fucking in midair, and it's like, oh god, no. So it's one of these days I'll probably go back to it just for shits and giggles or just for a project. But boy, there's so many other things that ahead of that line. I don't know if it's ever going to actually happen. But I definitely understand your perspective on the coloring. Yeah, sometimes the thing that you can't stand in the moment, that anachronistic quality, that what was it they were bitching about? Was it Photoshop, like first gen Photoshop?
Yeah, obvious filters.
Yeah, I can see that being quaint now and actually pinning it to its time period in a way that might be more novel now than it was then.
Yeah, and like Carl Baker sort of gave her crash course on Photoshop, and when you see like Carl Baker's, you know, digital work, you can see some of he was an early adopter, and he was fucking around with some like seriously cheesy filters on some of his like You Are Here and those books. So I can sort of see that influence. I think Twitter is my only social media, so if and it sounds asinine talking about, well, I tweeted this and I tweeted that. But I tweeted something about what I think Carl Baker taught her based on something I read in Comics Journal. And he came back and said, well, no, I showed her the ropes, you know. I gave her the gun, showed her how to load it, but I didn't teach her to fire it or something like that.
Don't blame me is the short version.
More or less, yeah. But I subsequently, I got it in black and white in the Dark Knight, in the Noir series. Okay. And while it's really nice, it's great to have it in black and white because the colours are so distinct. I don't know that it would have benefited from Lynn's, Varley's classic colour style, and I don't know that anybody else could have coloured it, and I don't know that it should have been published in black and white. So with those three things in mind, the final version is probably the only version that should have existed,
Yeah. Well, and also we were so used to seeing Miller in black and white, and he was so used to working in black and white in that time period that it is weird to have him be colored. But as you mentioned, that mid-'80s coloring that's so a part of Dark Knight Returns is also such a part of that time period. It would have been weird to see that sort of thing in the year 2000, So I see where you're coming from on that.
Yeah. I don't know. I can't defend it. I mean, and like with Miller as well, I'm kind of a I never want to get the name. I never want to get branded like an apologist.
Right.
I just have my opinions.
Yeah.
I think that Holy Terror was rubbish.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that was part of the problem with Dark Knight Strikes Back is that 9/11 fucked up his plans for that, and he redrew everything and incorporated his immediate feelings about that into the story, which is another whole thing that I hate about that book. So, yeah.
the sort of weird like change of tone in the third issue with like Billy Batson standing in the Twin Towers or whatever. That was pretty odd, but it's weird. I think in terms of like Holy Terror, it's pretty grim, and but I tried to read it kind of objectively, and the thing is, objectivism doesn't work with it because there's more to it than that. But there's actually only a couple of lines in it that are offensive. The work is inherently
skewed. Like the work is inherently has an ideology to it, so you can't impassively look at that. The work demands that you come at it with an opinion or take an opinion out of the work. It's almost more of an editorial cartoon than it is a story anyway. So it can't be taken in passively. You either are pro or against whatever the fuck he was doing in that thing. You have no choice in the matter. You have to take a side, basically.
He doesn't go into like in that. There's only a couple of lines which I would deem like inappropriate. Like there's a thing where he says something like, "All right, Ahmed or Imran or whatever your name is, it's got to be one of those two." Like that's the kind. That's for me. That's about as kind of like living in the UK and growing up in around that sort of racism towards brown people, basically, rather than black people.
Yeah.
That's the only thing that sounds to me like actually racist. The rest of it just feels racist.
Yeah. The implication is there. It's like Kevin O'Neill being censored by the Comics Code Authority just because his style is inherently offensive. Yeah, it's a lot like that. Yeah.
And those I picked up recently. I picked up the Kevin O'Neill Green Lantern issues that he did, and I'd had them before, but I wasn't into Kevin O'Neill at the time, so I had them when I had Dave Gibbons does one of them, and it's like the first what's his name, the Black Green Lantern. What's his name?
Oh, John Stewart.
John Stewart. So it's the first John Stewart in costume.
Okay.
And I lucked into them on eBay at a really reasonable price because everyone else wants them because of that, and I wanted them because it's got Kevin O'Neill in the back.
Yeah.
But it's full of these Kevin O'Neill monsters. It's kind of like people with eyes in their teeth and just like horrific stuff. That like now with his latter style on League of Extraordinary Gentlemen stuff, he's almost kind of mellowed with age a bit. But there was something about that period of time, that Tales of the Green Lantern story where Abin Sur is getting kind of basically programmed to fail by demons and stuff. Like, man, that stuff's it's beautiful, but it's horrific. And yeah, you're right. I could see why old ladies with a rubber stamp would decide that it was inappropriate for American children.
Well, and again, he could have drawn one of those old ladies, and it would still look perverse. It's just something inherent in his style in that time period was just so punk that he couldn't turn it off. But getting back to the Frank Miller thing, obviously I've been talking shade, but one thing that I do have a lot of trouble with, and I really do need to do a Dark Knight Returns review or something. You can't dispute who Frank Miller was in the 80s and what he contributed to comics literature. It's just that you saw that steady decline over the course of the 90s, and really from when he took his sabbatical to go do screenwriting, he never came all the way back from that in terms of the integrity of the work. I think that the first Sin City the serial, he came back with a passion, and so that was an exception. But you look at a lot of that other stuff he was doing at that same time period where it's just not he's just not as invested in it, and it's just not as good. And there's a lot of that like Hollywood mentality that he brings to it that I think hurts the work. But I don't care for all these Twitterati who try to act like Frank Miller wasn't Frank Miller in the 80s and try to pretend like this stuff doesn't hold up. It's just because you've been exposed to a Frank Miller style Batman for decades doesn't mean that it wasn't a seismic shift in that time period. And I am one of the people who, as I've gotten older, has shifted away from Dark Knight Returns and more toward Year One. But both of them are still pillars, of our art form. And to have so many people decide that because of Miller's politics that they're just going to hate the work, like you can't do that because then it's fucking Orwellian bullshit. It's like, don't act like he wasn't what he was. And I don't think that all the work holds up, but I think enough of it holds up that you can't disregard him. He can't just be set aside as like the weird old crank, There's no value to that work. Bullshit.
Did you, so a couple of things. So there was the thing about him getting invited to Thought Bubble, the UK Comic Con, and then getting uninvited because someone was like, this is the man who did Holy Terror. How could you invite him? And then, 35 webcomic authors signed a petition or something. and so Frank Miller got cancelled from that show. But like leaning into what you're saying, I mean, I think I've heard, I'm pretty sure I've heard, I know Alan Moore described him as right wing, and I'm pretty sure I've heard him described as right wing on your show by you or somebody else. But I don't think that's the word for him. I think he's a fool. And so my take on Frank Miller is that he's a small town boy who moved to the big city, got himself a job, self-educated, like he's autodidactic. But like a lot of people, he's run into the problem where in the absence of a teacher, he's just read this book and then he's read the book that person recommends. It's like pre-algorithm learning. So he's ended up at Ayn Rand because he likes Steve Ditko or whatever. So his whole worldview is defined by fucking Dashiell Hammett, Ayn Rand, and Steve Ditko. Right. And then he got mugged, and then that changed his whole politics. And then September the 11th happened, and that changed his whole like it sounds incredibly patronising, but I don't think I think he's missing like an education that would have given him the worldview that someone like Alan Moore has. And Alan Moore, I don't even know what his education is. I'm pretty sure he's also self-taught, but he just read everything. Whereas Frank Miller has that vibe of someone who's just done hopscotch from one creator to the next nearest creator, and had a couple of life things that have thrown him off along the way. And I think he would probably still consider himself liberal, and his whole like the 300 thing, that there's a bit of that in his Daredevil run of the hot gates and get them through like a narrow space, and then two men can take out 500. Like all of that was in his Daredevil. That 300 was 25 years in the making or whatever. Give Me Liberty is an incredibly Give Me Liberty's in line with my politics today. Give Me Liberty strikes me as a very sort of liberal piece of work, and I don't think he's gone too far from that. He's not published enough, and he's being near 9/11 made him do some weird stuff, and then he became a coke addict and an alcoholic and got all fucked up. Sorry. No,
it's good. I have a similar opinion with some divergences. I don't know. I'm assuming you guys have it over there, but we definitely have it over here. Basically, right-wing politicians and the money behind them essentially took over AM radio, and so
Rush Limbaugh's and
right, exactly. And so you've had decades of that AM talk radio where they try to. Well, I'm a reasonable person. I just don't believe that women should have a vote.
We don't have that.
And so I know a lot of these artists, especially the guys of his generation, they didn't have the internet, they didn't have streaming stuff, and so they would put on the radio to be their companions while they were working on their drawings, especially because it often seems to be the artists who got hooked into that. And like a lot of other Americans, I think think that just hours and hours of these guys making their points about stuff would lead to a guy like Frank Miller, who you'd say has some liberal principles, but then is also talking about those dirty rapists at Occupy Wall Street protests and stuff.
Yeah, that was like for me, to be honest, more than Holy Terror as a demonstration of like his politics, those kind of comments seem more decisive.
Right. And I think I agree with you. I don't think that he is a very literate person. I think he likes what he likes. He likes history. And so he read up on, did deep dives on that. And that's how he ended up with something like a 300. And he likes his detective novels and stuff. But I don't know. And of course, he's always been very cinema literate. He likes the visual style of the cinema and always incorporated that into his work the same way Will Eisner did. But I don't think he's super well read. And I do think that, like you said, he's had his opinion swayed by other forces. I just don't think it goes as far as reading Ayn Rand. I think it goes as far as listening to people who parrot stuff from her. Yeah. A lot of it's that weird hash of ideas that aren't compatible because you haven't thought them through to their natural conclusions because you're just sort of passively receiving a lot of this stuff. So he's a
forerunner for like modern sensibilities.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he's a proto Twitter maniac. You know?
Yeah. I do think that he's recognized the harm he's done himself, and I think that's one of the reasons why you just don't hear a lot from him these days.
Very much.
I think, yeah. I tend to agree with you. I don't know that he's like small town kid made good or anything, but I do think that he hasn't thought through a lot of this stuff in a way that he probably needed to in order to respond to it in a way that people can take seriously. I think that's one of my main issues with something like Holy Terror is he's on the side of that Bill Maher, well, why don't you people get together and take care of your own and make sure they're not blowing stuff up and being bad guys. And it's like, white Christian, let's have a talk about, some of the shit we've gotten up to, or, that kind of shit. So, I think there's just a lack of perspective, and I don't want to say gullibility, but again,
naivety for sure.
Colonel Dr. Crispy over here, he's just reacting to the last thing he heard without the whole process.
Yeah, very good. Bring it back. Yeah, so anyway, I thought Alien's Labyrinth was pretty solid.
You're really thinking, don't fuck with me like that, man. I don't need to try to find the edit point at 3 hours and 38 minutes in, okay? Don't be busting my balls here.
So do me a favor then. So it's not an easy thing to do, but like top 5 artists, like artists who you would buy books for.
Yeah, that's not so difficult because as a guy who mostly buys for characters and writers, I definitely buy for artists too. But if you're going 1, 2, 3, it's going to be probably character, writer, artist, or writer, character, artist. But
you probably have the inverse of me. If you ask me for top 5 writers, I'd be like, who would I most want to see Frank Whiteley draw for?
Right.
So. Yeah. So if you're thinking Jeremy DeMatteis is your number 1, then who's the best artist?
Yeah, exactly. But my approach is who are the guys that I will buy a book for, even if I don't freaking like the writer, or even if I don't like the character. What will I buy? And so for me, Paul Gulacy, I adore his stuff. I've always loved his stuff. Mark Texeira would be on that list. Steve Lytle would be on that list. Jim Starlin, although generally the stuff that Jim Starlin draws, he also writes. So, and a lot of times it's the writing and. Confessional, not so much since the 90s, but the 80s and 70s stuff more. I'm trying to think of who else. Barry Smith is another guy that he's not in the same league of the other guys because like you talked about, remember his Armstrong run? It's like, I didn't buy those, I didn't buy most of the guy stuff. So I'm not the guy, but I did make sure to pick up, Monsters when that came out, and I need to get around to reading it, but it's Bible thick. So it's like, I'll get around, maybe I'll take it on a trip or something with me. I'm trying to think of who else would be in that category, but that's a pretty good starting point. If one of those guys draws a book, there's a very good chance I'm going to pick it up regardless, just because I have such an affection for their art. So I can't think of anybody else right off the top of my head. I'm sure there's going to be somebody like, fuck, I forgot so and so, but just off the top of my head, those are the guys.
But that's so for me, like on that list, like Jim Starlin is someone who I've never had any interest in at all.
He's very unique unique anatomy. You know,
Right.
I can see where that'd be very off-putting for a lot of people. His very wonky ass anatomy, for instance.
Yeah, so Ron Lim I don't like at all, and Ron Lim is like wannabe Jim Starlin, and for me it's that kind of like never taken a life drawing class.
Oh yeah, he's so much a person.
I don't need everyone to be John
He's that guy.
Buscema.
I remember people complaining about Rob Liefeld because he was one of these guys who draws like somebody who ever only learned to draw comics from comics, and Ron Lim is 1,000% that same guy. You just so when you bringing that up, I did like his earlier stuff when he was just drawing a book a month, like the earlier Silver Surfer issues and X Mutants and stuff like that. Hero Alliance, which nobody remembers anymore. But once he became the guy who drew 2 Marvel books a month for 5 years straight, that stuff is very off-putting to me. It's just so comics. It's just so generic comic book thing, you know?
Yeah, it looks like what some TV executive would expect a poster of a comic to look like. Or, it's the lowest common denominator comic. But I recently picked up the Warlock Gallery edition, big oversized hardcover of
Same.
And that's fucking lovely. That's kind of made me reevaluate Jim Starlin's art a bit, I've got to say. I mean, there's Steve Lealoa inks on it, which helps. But regardless, I was quite surprised how much I'm enjoying it. And then Paul Galassi, I've come to backwards, so I wasn't too keen on so much of his kind of wide-eyed, kind of cataracty looking people. Everyone standing like 100% facing the camera, and all quite rigid. But I've never read the Master of Kung Fu stuff, but I've read so much good stuff like Six from Sirius 6 and Slash Maraud, a couple of Batman issues he did, which are just phenomenal. I've reevaluated Galassi as well. And then Steve Lytle did too few comics. Like I'm not a Legion of Superheroes guy, so I've not read a lot of that. But the Typhoid Mary thing that he did for Marvel, and that the Red Sonja comic that I mentioned in my tweet about in response to your Conan, that Red Sonja comic's fucking gorgeous. What a loss that guy didn't do more comics.
Yeah, he had a period there because he was not prolific, as pointed out.
He was cover guy, right?
Mostly, yeah. Especially, he made his bones on Legion of Superheroes, and after that, he mostly did covers for various DC books for years and years until I think maybe that dried up a little bit. But he had a period where he was doing a cycling series of serials for Marvel Comics Presents. And in particular, he did a lot of stuff with Anna Cinti involving the Typhoid character, Typhoid Mary. Yeah. And they did collect that into a trade, and I was very happy to look at those books. They're very weird, and I don't know how well they hold up because I haven't reread them in ages. But if
Typhoid's Kiss, it was called.
Typhoid's Kiss, right. And I think it had a Joe Madureira cover, in fact, from a random Spider-Man appearance by the character. But that's a nice little collection of him drawing very much in that same style as he did the Red Sonja. Although some of it's a little bit more rough. I think he was trying to incorporate some more Frank Miller Sin City stuff into his mix. But it's a nice little collection of him drawing in that style. But what I'd really love for them to do is a collection of his covers too, because he just, especially on Legion, just some truly fantastic covers. And also he had a tendency, he would do an issue here, issue there. And it would have been nice after he passed if they'd have done some kind of memorial where they just put all that stuff into one book. And I would 100% line up for that. But mostly it's covers and trading cards and just like various spot illustrations. He was an okay sequential artist, but he just wasn't remotely prolific, and so it's mostly defined by the single images that he produced.
Yeah, and who else did you say? I mean, Barry Windsor Smith is an obvious one, but yeah. So who? Oh yeah, Mark Tex. I mean, he's just great. I mean, my first Mark Tex was the Maverick backups in X-Men 10 and 11 or whatever it was. In fact, I say whatever it was, I know it was X-Men 10 and 11, and then the Wolverine that followed. And for me, that Wolverine run was brilliant. Apart from Wolverine being 6'8" or something, but you had Mark Tex for 6 issues, 7 issues, and then there's a fill-in, and they get fucking Mark Pacella. I mean, just unbelievable. The story's just utterly undermined by the fact that the art changes for the horrific for 1 or 2 issues. So yeah, I don't own any of those anymore.
Yeah, Pacella was definitely a guy I loathed. Mark Pagliarulo was another guy who just kept ruining comics for me. Basically, anybody who did JLA that wasn't Howard Porter in that time period, like Val Simics. I've never liked his stuff, but at least he's competent. But I just don't like his stuff. But yeah, Mark Padrillo, Mark Pacello, those are guys who just like one of my great disses is like if I'm looking at a comic book and I'm like, I'm pretty sure I could have done this better. And those are both guys that at least get me into that particular area where it's like I could have probably, I'm not anything. I'm pretty awful, but I don't think I'm quite as awful as these guys.
Yeah, well, the Mark Pacello one's interesting because during lockdown I've had a few sort of reevaluations or discoveries of stuff that I already knew about, but I've suddenly gone, actually, you know what? And so there was a load of Gru. I had a load of Gru, and then thought, fuck, this lockdown stuff's pretty depressing. I'm going to get a load of Gru. And so I basically spent about a year filling in every Aragones gap that I could, and I've got tons of Sergio Aragones comics now, probably because of the need for laughing in modern life. But another one was Mr. Monster, and Mr. Monster in some of the later stuff is drawn. So Michael T. Gilbert is his own man, but for a lot of Mr. Monster, he's actually not there. He's laying it out, writing it, laying it out, but not finishing it. And Mark Pacello is actually doing the finishes on several of the Mr. Monster comics, and that was my kind of, oh god, this guy existed before Rob Liefeld decided that he was leaving X-Force. And so yeah, he's still terrible by any measure afterwards, but I suspect that he might have been an artist at some point before following Liefeld.
Well, for a while there, Michel Fife was talking up Vince Giordano, and it's like, if you go back far enough, there is a time where he could do some okay artwork, but he's another one of those guys where it's like, don't miss me with that bullshit, big time. But yeah, I was having flashbacks from all the research I was doing on the Michael T. Gilbert stuff for Spawnometer and the proto trencher, proto black ball, that kind of stuff, which I still need to get back to for the second part. Another one though, since you mentioned it, because Dan Panosian was also doing a bunch of stuff around the same time period, and he got to become a good artist. He I think he was a good artist before, and then he did the period expected bullshit, and he came back around again. I think he's like, I really enjoy his cover work in recent years, for instance.
Yeah, no, he's doing some great work. I mean, his next thing is a Scott Snyder book, but like Slots that he did looks like a Jack Davis influenced kind of
very 60s quality, very very 60s paperback pulp kind of thing going on with him. So I dig that.
Yeah, Dan Panosian's come back great. Annoyingly, he did like 2 out of 4. Like I picked up a couple of issues of Conan that he did for Dark Horse, but they were parts 3 and 4 of a 5-part story or something. But they looked amazing. It's just really irritating that it wasn't the whole thing. But yeah, I forgot about your Michael T. Gilbert bit. Just to tie into the fucking Trencher.
Right. Well, see, the plan was it was for Black Ball Comics and all the guys who would make Black Ball Comics. But then the schedule of Spawnometer fell off a cliff repeatedly. He's like, how do you fall off a cliff twice? Like, somehow we hit a plateau and then fell off another one. But yeah, it was always intended to be a 2-parter, and the first part was going to be before Trencher was at Image, and then the second part was going to be after, where it continued on with Black Ball and Simon Bisley and all the other guys, Mark Hempel and Dimo Barr was in that mix too, because he was supposed to do a book for them.
Yeah.
And so that's just sitting on the computer, waiting to be resolved. Now, literally, I've got shit that's years old for Spawnometer. Like I've recorded the Wetworks episodes years ago, and it's just a matter of actually editing them into something cogent.
How far do you go with Wetworks?
The entire series. Yeah, I try to do the entire series in one episode with 2 different people at 2 different times. And so it's going back through that material and editing into ideally 1 or 2 episodes at most.
But you didn't do that with Wildcats, right?
No. See, here's the thing.
What made you go full bore on Wildcats? Because Wetworks?
Because it was a creator-owned book, or it wasn't really a creator-owned book. It was supposed to be a creator-owned book whose creator left it within the first year, and it just became this mini major corporate corporate nonsense. So it's like most of Wildstorm, since it got sold out to DC, I don't feel like it deserves to be covered as part of Spawnometer, because the part of it is I want to talk about creator-owned books, and I don't want to have a creator-owned book podcast where I'm talking about DC properties all the fucking time. So it's like, okay, so I read through the entire run of Wetworks, and it's like, okay, I'm going to just fucking vomit this shit into a podcast and be done with it. And unfortunately, Mr. Fix-It wasn't a great receptacle for all that creative vomit. And so then I went over to Ryan Daly and vomited on him too, and got a little bit of his words in as well. And now I got to go through like 5 hours of recordings or something and turn it into hopefully an hour or two long podcast. So that's the kind of dumb shit that makes Spawnometer not happen.
Yeah. It's 40 issues of Wetworks.
Yeah. I mean, and it's not all bad. It's just funny because if you go, and also Will Sportacio's life and career is very interesting in and of itself. So that's why I think it's going to be at least 2, because I took all this found interview material, and it's like, holy shit, you went into a diabetic coma for 6 months and all kinds of shit like that. Like, what the hell?
And it was a bit weird. Like, I remember at the time, like, not knowing anything about him before, it was like, oh, so he's got this comic called Wetworks coming out. Great. And from the preview in Wildcat, it looks like it's going to be Predator, but with people that are made of gold. So that looks great. And it's like, his sister's just died of lupus. And maybe it's because of studying Latin, but I was like, lupus, that means wolf. I've never heard of that illness otherwise. And then it's like, Wetworks is going to be about vampires versus werewolves. And I was like, hang on, what? So it was like, did his sister's disease define everything about Wetworks and completely change it from being gold people doing Predator shit? But I don't know. Yeah.
No, actually, if I recall correctly from the research, that was an entirely different person responsible for that, because if you look at his original game plan, he was wanting to do something kind of along the lines of Akira, but with a super team. And somebody, I think might have been, I don't think it was Brandon Choi, I think it was somebody else, suggested, well, why don't you have him fight the Universal monsters building up to that? And then it never got out of that zone, because he got less and less to do with the material the further along it went. So he had a whole different thing that he wanted to do that they got away from almost immediately. So that's part of why I didn't want to spend a ton of time with it, because like this isn't even what you wanted it to be, you know? So why are we going to spend all this time talking about your creator own thing that you sold and have nothing to do with?
Yeah.
Which is a shame, because I loved Will Sportacio. He was an absolute favorite of mine for a long time there, and I wanted to read. I think I bought the first issue of Wetworks, and that was the only one I ever bought in the time period, because looking at all these dumb looking gold guys, you know, I was just like, this isn't my bag. So and I liked it okay rereading it, because I liked the whole monsters versus soldiers thing. It was kind of cute, like you said, kind of a Predator thing. But yeah, it has its moments, but it doesn't come to anything, so it really feels like a waste of time reading it overall.
All the bullshit sort of legend type stuff is where it really fun. So I picked up issue 1 recently because I was going through like a Scott Williams inks thing, because he'd inked the first few Cyberforce, he'd inked a couple of Pit 2 but not 3, I think.
Yeah, that sounds right. I remember, because the one that he inked was phenomenal, and it looked, I mean, I always loved Del Keown stuff, but it looked even better. I felt like that one time he inked it, I thought they were complementing each other fairly well, and I think he did like a Amazing Heroes cover with him as well, just a few bits and pieces here and there with him inking them.
So you had Del Keown doing all of his Marvel's Hulk stuff, then you had the preview from Youngblood 4, Pit 1, and then by all accounts he was like, oh, I didn't realise it would print so dark, and then made some sort of shift, got Joe Chiodo on colours, everything turned orange, but the line work was lovely, but for some reason it got all superhero-y after number 2. But I digress. I was getting all of my Scott Williams comics, so I got Wetworks 1, and then when I got Wetworks 1 I was like, oh, I wonder what happened next. I can't remember what happened next. So I got 2 and 3, and it's just so fucking trite, just like everyone's called Blood something or something Blood, you know? It's like as bad as that wizard gag of, you know, choosing a word from column A and column B, blood arm blood, arm wing, wing blood. On the Wetworks, everything was like blood, wind, and we're subscribing to the sucker, and it's just terrible.
Yeah, and they never really hammered down the lore very well, because again, nobody stayed. Like, I don't think Brandon Choi lasted either. I think they had other creators in there by the teens, so there was just nobody was ever invested in that property. And yet Todd McFarlane made like half a dozen action figures of these guys, you know, which is the 90s in a nutshell. It's like, okay, nobody gives a shit about this, nobody's invested in this, let's make but they look cool, and yeah, there's some some of the best McFarlane figures ever made, I felt like. But yeah, the book itself is just like, what the fuck is this? It just meanders and it just gets really weird, and they kill off characters willy-nilly, and it's just kind of a mess. By the way, we trailed off. Were you ever going to do your guys I buy stuff for whenever they come about, you know? Because I didn't mean to, like, we just sort of springboard off that. It's like, well, wait, were you going to do yours?
No, the list of artists is probably too long, so I probably flipped.
Oh yeah, I figured you'd flip it. Yeah.
So Grant Morrison is someone that I'll normally pay attention to, and then otherwise, right? Like honestly, Grant Morrison and Alan Moore, and not many more. Like Neil Gaiman does so little that when he turns up, it tends to be a high-profile project, so everyone's looking at it, you know. But he's not someone that I necessarily care about enough to follow. But Grant Morrison is someone who does it for me, and Brian Azzarello is the other writer who's probably on my radar, but doesn't generally disappoints for the most part. And then Mark Waid, I guess. So that's 5. Alan Moore, Grant Morrison, Neil Gaiman, Mark Waid, and Brian Azzarello are the writers who I'll pay attention to, although with varying levels of success. Like I don't claim to overly enjoy even 50% of what they do.
Of the ones you named, my most routine purchase would be Grant Morrison. I stay away from Marvel stuff when he does Marvel stuff, but I'm at least interested in giving him a try, just because even if I don't like it, I know he's going to be doing the best he can with what he's doing. Like he never seems to do a paycheck gig. He's always gotten like really into it and has some sort of a passion for what he's working on. Alan Moore is brilliant at times, but I've always found, and I'm sure I've mentioned this on podcasts, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but he's that Kubrickian coldness. And so there were some things I really love. Like I really love his Wildcats run, and I'm looking forward to eventually in the year 2035 or ever, probably like posthumously, I'll be doing it in the afterlife, talking about that material.
Why would you board?
Yeah. With Gaiman, I've been revisiting Gaiman because of the Sandman series on Netflix. I've recently reread the first couple of trades so that we can talk about that on a podcast up forthcoming. And Gaiman was a guy who just absolutely blew my mind. I think he impacted me the way that a lot of people were impacted by Alan Moore, by expanding what I thought comic books could be. But at the same time, I generally don't like his stuff. Like even before the end of Sandman, I was kind of over Sandman. And then like everything he did post Sandman in comics, just none of it did anything for me. So the stuff I love deeply, but I only love so much stuff. And I it didn't have, because I tried a lot of that shit. You know, I was a proper fanboy. I bought the fucking Alice Cooper shit. I bought, all the wonky stuff that he was doing in that time period. I bought goddamn techno comics. I'm sure that did not help his reputation with me. Yeah. So I don't feel strongly.
But I started with him on Death.
Yeah.
And that's Bacallo.
Yeah.
And that was before I knew Bacallo. So I came to it primarily because of the art, and because there was a number one that I could get into, whereas Sandman was already on issue 20 or whatever. But if I'd read Sandman cold, I think the art probably would have turned me off. Whereas now my favourite Neil Gaiman comics are Signal to Noise, Mr. Punch.
Okay. So Dave McKean stuff.
Violent Cases. Yeah. But not just because of the art, but just because they feel more like personal stories. And then P. Greg Russell did adaptations of his
Coraline. I remember him doing, and
Coraline was wicked. And then what's it called? It's not The Jungle, The Graveyard Book, I think it's called.
Did they adapt that one into comics? I didn't realize they did that one. Okay.
Yeah. So that went straight to that was novelized that was graphic novelized. So it's 2 graphic novels published by someone weird, Chronicle, Abrams,
HarperCollins, and
exactly. In fact, I think it might have been HarperCollins. Yeah. And then, but it's P. Greg Russell on his own, and then P. Greg Russell with Galen Showman, but then P. Greg Russell with Kevin Nolan for about 20 pages, which is fucking gorgeous.
Right.
And then P. Greg Russell with David LaFuente, which is gorgeous, and P. Greg Russell with Scott Hampton, and overall, between those 2 books, you've got a really good comic. So they're worth a look. But yeah, generally speaking, I think Sandman falls apart. Like if they could go back and get Mark Hempel to draw the whole thing, or
obviously not for me because I hated the Hempel stuff. But for me, I don't understand why Kelly Jones didn't draw the entire series after they pushed Ed-In-Burrow off.
Kelly Jones, Charles Vest, there's various people.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate the diversity, and certainly some of those artists worked really well in the specific books that they told, the stories they told. But like my artist would probably be Kelly Jones, because it just felt like that was the most right of any artist to be able to actually do the entire series. Where there were some pieces like the Hempel stuff, I struggled with. I could not. It's not that I hate Mark Hempel. I'm not a fan, but I don't hate him. I liked him on like Breathtaker and things like that. But the cognitive dissonance of there you go. The cognitive dissonance of looking at his cartoonish art with the type of horror story that they were trying to tell with the kindly ones. I just couldn't resolve that ever. Now maybe if I go back and read it as an adult, I'll feel differently about it. But the Interminable Wait issue after issue, I don't know. I don't remember how long it was, but it felt like it took 2 years to tell that story. And I had such an axe to grind with the book by the time Kindly Ones was done that I never recovered in my affections as a result of that. But like, for instance, I struggled with Sean McManus on A Game of You, but by the end of it, I recognized what he brought to the table, and he was the right artist for that story after all. But I didn't necessarily see that in the early going. Where Hempel, I never came around to on that story.
Well, I think Hempel, like I think potentially if like things had worked out differently, then Hempel would conceivably have been like Kevin O'Neill, I think, or Mick McMahon or somebody like that. I think that's what Gaiman was going for, The fact that O'Neill never did any any of that kind of horror feels like a bit of a loss. But yeah, for me, Sandman, the downside art wise is like Jill Thompson at that time.
Yeah, I struggle with Jill Thompson stuff too. But I don't even remember the name of the arc, but I didn't care for that one either. Yeah.
Was it bits of it was framing sequences, or it was like the majority of an arc even? No.
I want to say she had an arc of her own. I think it might have been the one that preceded Hempel's, in fact, because I think there was this long period where I was not enjoying that book and buying it by inertia. And Thompson's, I never completely warmed to Thompson in general. Anyway, I respect her, but I'm not a fan. But on the right story, I'm sure she's fine. I think that she's a good combination with Neil Gaiman. I just don't remember liking the particular story that she did when she was working on Sandman. I don't remember. For starters, the fact that I don't even remember what story she told, but I remember her being on there, and I remember not liking it.
I'm curious now what the Sandman books were.
Green Pages blog, Canoes, Chris Dunkard, Chris Lydon, Dear Watchers, a Comics Omniverse podcast, Ed Moore, Explorer National Parks, Gregory Litchfield, The Hammer Strikes Random Geeky Stuff, History of Comics on Film, Iowa's Joe Is, Jeffrey Brown They Them, King Dinosaur, Mike and Some Idiots to Me, Randy Caldwell, Resurrections, and Adam Warlock and Dennis Podcast, Scott X, Speaker of the House Kirk Spencer, Tim Price the Podcrasher, and Wibbly Wobbly Dicey Wicey Role Playing Game Podcast.
Next.
Okay, let's see.